The collapse of Parthian power in the early 3rd century AD created a vacuum that would be filled by one of history's most enduring Persian dynasties. From the highland fortress of Istakhr in Fars province, a minor vassal king named Ardashir I began orchestrating what would become the most significant political transformation in Iranian history since the fall of the Achaemenids 6 centuries earlier. The Sasanian revolution that emerged from this remote corner of the Iranian plateau would reshape the ancient world's balance of power for the next 400 years. Ardashir's grandfather, Sasan, had served as a priest at the fire temple of Anahita in Istakhr, lending his name to the dynasty that would dominate the Middle East. The family claimed descent from the legendary Achaemenid kings, though this genealogical connection remains historically dubious. What cannot be disputed is Ardashir's remarkable military and political acumen, which transformed him from a regional governor into the architect of a new empire. By 208 AD, he had inherited control over the Persis region from his father Papak, but the young ruler harboured ambitions that extended far beyond the boundaries of his modest principality. The Parthian Empire under the Arsacid dynasty had grown increasingly fragmented throughout the 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Regional satraps exercised near autonomous control over their territories, while successive weak kings struggled to maintain central authority from their capital at Ctesiphon. The empire's decentralized feudal structure, which had once been a source of flexibility and resilience, now became a fatal weakness as ambitious regional rulers began asserting independence. Ardashir recognized this vulnerability and methodically began expanding his influence throughout Fars province, absorbing neighbouring kingdoms and principalities through a combination of military conquest and strategic alliances. The decisive confrontation between the rising Sasanian power and the declining Arsacid dynasty occurred at the Battle of Hormizdagan in 224 AD. Artabanus V, the last Parthian king, personally led his forces against Ardashir's army on the plains of Hormizdagan, located in the region between modern-day Isfahan and Hamadan. The battle represented more than a simple dynastic struggle. It was a clash between two fundamentally different visions of Persian kingship and imperial organization. Artabanus V commanded the traditional Parthian heavy cavalry, the cataphracts whose armoured horsemen had dominated Middle Eastern battlefields for centuries. These warriors, encased in scale armour and wielding long lances, had proven devastatingly effective against Roman legions at Carrhae in 53 BC and numerous subsequent engagements. However, the Parthian military system suffered from the same decentralization that plagued their political structure. Many regional nobles arrived late to the battle or failed to appear entirely, leaving Artabanus with a significantly reduced force. Ardashir's army reflected the organizational innovations that would characterize Sasanian military doctrine. While he too relied heavily on heavy cavalry, his forces demonstrated superior discipline and coordination. The Sasanian king had spent years developing a more centralized command structure, ensuring that his regional governors and military commanders remained directly accountable to royal authority. His cavalry units operated with unprecedented tactical flexibility, combining the traditional shock power of cataphracts with more mobile horse archers who could harass enemy formations and exploit weaknesses in their lines. The battle itself unfolded across the dusty plains under the harsh Persian sun. Artabanus V positioned his forces in the traditional Parthian formation, with heavy cavalry in the centre and horse archers on the flanks. Ardashir adopted a more innovative approach, deploying his cataphracts in multiple echelons that could maintain pressure on the enemy while preserving reserves for decisive moments. The initial Parthian charge achieved limited success, but Ardashir's tactical reserves quickly countered, preventing any breakthrough in the Sasanian lines. As the day progressed, the superior organization and morale of Ardashir's forces began to tell. Parthian units, lacking effective coordination, found themselves isolated and vulnerable to concentrated Sasanian attacks. The decisive moment came when Ardashir personally led a cavalry charge that broke through the Parthian centre, directly engaging Artabanus V in single combat. Contemporary sources describe the encounter in vivid detail. Both kings wielded traditional Persian swords while mounted on heavily armoured war horses, their personal combat serving as a microcosm of the larger dynastic struggle. Artabanus V fell in this engagement, struck down by Ardashir's blade, effectively ending 4.5 centuries of Arsacid rule. The immediate aftermath of Hormizdagan saw rapid Sasanian consolidation across the Iranian plateau. Unlike previous Persian conquerors who often retained existing administrative structures, Ardashir implemented comprehensive reforms designed to centralize authority and eliminate the feudal fragmentation that had weakened Parthian rule. He systematically removed Arsacid nobles from positions of power, replacing them with loyal supporters drawn primarily from Fars province and other regions that had supported his rise. Ctesiphon, the former Parthian capital located on the Tigris River, opposite the ancient city of Seleucia, became the administrative centre of the new Sasanian Empire. Ardashir's decision to retain this location rather than establishing a new capital demonstrated his practical understanding of imperial governance. Ctesiphon's strategic position controlled access to Mesopotamia's agricultural wealth, while maintaining connections to both the Iranian highlands and the western territories that bordered the Roman Empire. The city's existing administrative infrastructure, developed over centuries of Parthian rule, could be adapted to serve Sasanian purposes without the massive expense of constructing an entirely new capital. The transformation of Ctesiphon under early Sasanian rule reflected broader changes in Persian imperial ideology. Ardashir ordered the construction of new royal palaces that incorporated architectural elements from Achaemenid Persepolis, visually reinforcing his dynasty's claimed connection to Iran's ancient imperial tradition. The famous Tak Kasra, a massive barrel-vaulted audience hall, became the physical embodiment of Sasanian royal power. This architectural marvel, with its soaring brick arch spanning over 80 feet without intermediate support, demonstrated both the technical sophistication and imperial ambitions of the new dynasty. Religious reform represented perhaps the most significant departure from Parthian precedent. The Arsacids had generally maintained a tolerant approach toward religious diversity within their empire, allowing various cults and belief systems to coexist with minimal state interference. Ardashir fundamentally altered this policy by establishing Zoroastrianism as the official state religion and creating a centralized priestly hierarchy directly subordinate to royal authority. This religious centralization served multiple political purposes. It provided ideological justification for Sasanian rule, created a unified administrative class loyal to the crown, and differentiated the new dynasty from its Parthian predecessors. Karter, who would later become the most powerful Zoroastrian priest in Sasanian history, began his rise during Ardashir's reign. The king appointed him to oversee the establishment of fire temples throughout the empire and coordinate the training of a professional priesthood. These religious officials served dual functions as spiritual leaders and administrative agents of the central government, creating an unprecedented fusion of religious and secular authority. Fire temples became not only centres of worship, but also repositories of royal decrees, tax records, and other governmental documents. The Sasanian religious reforms extended beyond mere administrative reorganisation to encompass fundamental changes in imperial ideology. Ardashir promoted the concept of divine kingship more aggressively than his Parthian predecessors, claiming direct divine sanction from Ahura Mazda for his rule. Royal inscriptions from this period emphasize the king's role as the earthly representative of the supreme deity, responsible for maintaining cosmic order and protecting the faithful from the forces of darkness and chaos. This ideological framework provided powerful justification for centralized authority and helped legitimize the dramatic political changes accompanying the dynastic transition. Administrative reforms complemented religious changes in creating a more centralized imperial structure. Ardashir abolished the semi-autonomous satrapies that had characterized Parthian governance, replacing them with directly appointed provincial governors who served at royal pleasure. These officials, drawn primarily from the Sasanian nobility and loyal supporters of the new regime, received regular salary payments from the central treasury rather than relying on local taxation rights. This financial arrangement ensured their continued dependence on royal favour, while reducing opportunities for the kind of regional autonomy that had undermined Parthian authority. The new administrative system incorporated sophisticated record-keeping procedures that tracked population, agricultural production, and military resources across the empire. Royal scribes, many trained in the Zoroastrian priesthood, maintained detailed registers of landholding, taxation, and military service obligations. This bureaucratic apparatus provided the central government with unprecedented knowledge of imperial resources and enabled more effective coordination of military campaigns and public works projects. Military reorganization accompanied administrative reform in strengthening central authority. Ardashir established a professional standing army directly controlled by the royal court, reducing dependence on feudal levies that had proven unreliable during the Parthian period. The new military structure maintained the traditional emphasis on heavy cavalry, while incorporating improved training, standardized equipment, and centralized command procedures. Regional military commanders received direct appointments from the king and could be transferred between different theatres of operation to prevent the development of personal loyalties that might challenge royal authority. Territorial expansion began almost immediately following the consolidation of power within Iran proper. Armenia, with its strategic position controlling access routes between the Iranian plateau and Anatolia, became an early target of Sasanian ambitions. The Armenian nobility had maintained complex relationships with both Parthian and Roman authorities, often playing these great powers against each other to preserve their own autonomy. Ardashir's more centralized approach to imperial governance threatened this traditional balance, leading to armed resistance from Armenian princes who feared the loss of their traditional privileges. The Sasanian conquest of Armenia involved both military campaigns and diplomatic maneuvering designed to exploit divisions within the Armenian nobility. Some Armenian princes, recognizing the futility of resistance against the reinvigorated Persian Empire, accepted Sasanian suzerainty in exchange for confirmation of their local authority. Others, particularly those with strong ties to Roman commercial networks, sought military support from Constantinople. This division within Armenian society enabled Ardashir to achieve substantial territorial gains while avoiding the massive military commitments that would have been required for complete conquest. Mesopotamia, with its ancient cities and agricultural wealth, represented another crucial target for early Sasanian expansion. The region's strategic importance extended beyond its economic value to encompass its role as a buffer against Roman expansion eastward. Ardashir's forces encountered limited resistance in most Mesopotamian cities, whose populations had grown weary of the political instability that characterized late Parthian rule. The promise of restored order and effective governance proved attractive to merchant communities and agricultural producers who had suffered from decades of intermittent warfare and administrative neglect. The Roman Empire under Alexander Severus initially underestimated the significance of the Sasanian Revolution, viewing Ardashir's rise as merely another episode in the chronic instability that had plagued Parthian territories for generations. This miscalculation would prove costly as Sasanian forces began probing Roman positions along the Euphrates frontier. Unlike their Parthian predecessors, who had often relied on irregular warfare and sudden raids, the Sasanians demonstrated a capacity for sustained military campaigns supported by sophisticated logistical networks. The first major Romano-Sasanian confrontation occurred when Ardashir's forces besieged the Roman fortress city of Nisibis in northern Mesopotamia. The siege demonstrated several important characteristics of early Sasanian military doctrine: systematic preparation, effective coordination between different types of forces, and the ability to maintain extended operations far from their Iranian homeland. Roman defenders, accustomed to dealing with Parthian hit-and-run tactics, found themselves facing a more methodical and persistent enemy, capable of conducting complex siege operations. Alexander Severus responded to these Sasanian incursions by organising a major military expedition designed to restore Roman prestige and secure the eastern frontier. The emperor's campaign, launched in 231 AD, involved substantial forces drawn from multiple provinces and represented the most significant Roman military effort in the east since Trajan's campaigns over a century earlier. However, the expedition revealed fundamental Roman misunderstanding of the changed circumstances in Iran and the superior organisational capabilities of the new Sasanian regime. The Roman campaign achieved limited tactical successes, but failed to address the strategic reality of Sasanian consolidation. Alexander Severus's forces succeeded in relieving several besieged cities and conducting retaliatory raids into Sasanian territory, but they could not prevent Ardashir from continuing his systematic expansion of Persian influence throughout the region. The emperor's premature declaration of victory and withdrawal of forces from the eastern frontier allowed the Sasanians to resume their territorial acquisitions with minimal interference. These early Romano-Sasanian conflicts established patterns that would characterize relations between the two empires for the next 4 centuries. The Sasanians demonstrated superior strategic planning and logistical capabilities, while the Romans retained advantages in siege warfare and infantry tactics. Neither side possessed the decisive superiority necessary to achieve permanent conquest of the other's core territories, leading to a prolonged struggle for control over the buffer regions of Armenia and northern Mesopotamia. The establishment of Sasanian power fundamentally altered the geopolitical balance in the ancient Middle East. Unlike the decentralized Parthian system, which had often allowed Roman influence to penetrate deep into Iranian territories through diplomatic and commercial networks, the new Persian regime presented a unified and ideologically coherent challenge to Roman hegemony. The combination of religious legitimacy, administrative efficiency, and military innovation created an imperial structure capable of sustained competition with Rome on equal terms. The death of Ardashir in 240 AD marked the transition from revolutionary founder to imperial consolidator, as his son Shapur ascended the throne of an empire still defining its identity and testing its limits. The new king inherited not merely territorial holdings, but a complex administrative apparatus, a reformed military structure, and most critically, an ideological framework that positioned the Sasanian dynasty as the legitimate heir to Iran's ancient imperial tradition. Unlike his father, who'd spent his reign establishing the basic foundations of Sasanian power, Shapur I would transform these foundations into the infrastructure of sustained greatness. The young monarch's accession occurred during a period of relative stability within the empire's core territories, allowing him to focus on external expansion and internal development projects that would define his 32-year reign. Contemporary sources describe Shapur as possessing both his father's strategic acumen and a more grandiose vision of Persian imperial destiny. Standing tall with the characteristic aquiline nose of the Sasanian royal family, he cultivated an image of divine kingship that surpassed even Ardashir's innovations in royal ideology. His elaborate court ceremonies, conducted in the magnificent audience halls of Ctesiphon, featured hundreds of courtiers arranged in strict hierarchical order, their silk robes reflecting the wealth flowing into Sasanian coffers from expanded trade networks and territorial acquisitions. The Roman Empire during this period presented an increasingly attractive target for Sasanian ambitions. The crisis of the 3rd century had begun undermining Roman stability, with frequent changes of emperor, economic inflation, and military rebellions, creating opportunities that a unified Persian state could exploit. Unlike the previous generation's conflicts, which had primarily involved border skirmishes and limited territorial adjustments, Shapur envisioned campaigns that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between the two empires. His military preparations reflected this expanded scope, involving the systematic accumulation of siege equipment, the training of specialized engineering units, and the development of logistical networks capable of supporting extended operations deep in Roman territory. The first major military campaign of Shapur's reign targeted the Roman positions in northern Mesopotamia, beginning with a systematic assault on the fortress city of Carrhae in 243 AD. The Sasanian approach to siege warfare had evolved considerably since Ardashia's time, incorporating sophisticated techniques borrowed from both Roman and Chinese military traditions. Shapur's engineers constructed massive siege towers that towered above the city's walls, their wooden frameworks protected by iron plates and wet hides to prevent fire damage. These structures housed multiple levels of archers and crossbowmen who could rain projectiles down upon the defenders while providing cover for assault troops, advancing with scaling ladders and battering rams. The siege engines deployed at Carrhae demonstrated remarkable technical sophistication. Massive torsion catapults, operated by teams of specially trained artillerists, hurled stone projectiles weighing over 100 pounds against the city's fortifications. The impact of these missiles created visible cracks in the masonry walls, while the psychological effect on the defenders proved equally devastating. Sasanian engineers had also developed improved versions of the traditional battering ram, mounting bronze-headed rams on wheeled platforms that could be maneuvered precisely against weak points in the defensive walls. The fall of Carrhae after a 3-month siege provided Shapur with both strategic advantages and valuable intelligence about Roman defensive capabilities. Captured Roman engineers revealed details about fortress construction techniques and garrison supply procedures that would prove invaluable in subsequent campaigns. More importantly, the systematic nature of the Sasanian victory demonstrated to other Roman cities in the region that resistance would be both futile and costly, encouraging several smaller settlements to surrender without fighting. Shapur's military successes in Mesopotamia attracted the attention of Emperor Gordian III, who organized a substantial expeditionary force to counter the Persian advance. The young Roman emperor, barely 20 years old and heavily influenced by his praetorian prefect, Timesitheus, commanded an army that included veteran legions recalled from the Rhine and Danube frontiers. These troops represented some of Rome's finest military units, with decades of experience fighting Germanic tribes and other barbarian opponents. However, their expertise in frontier warfare against less organized enemies had not prepared them for confrontation with the sophisticated military machine that Shapur had developed. The decisive engagement occurred near the ancient city of Mysice in 244 AD, where Sasanian forces demonstrated their tactical evolution beyond traditional Parthian methods. Shapur deployed his heavy cavalry in coordinated formations that could maintain sustained pressure on enemy positions, while preserving sufficient reserves to exploit breakthrough opportunities. The Persian cataphracts, encased in scale armour that covered both rider and horse, wielded 12-foot lances with iron points designed to penetrate Roman mail armour. Behind these shock troops, mobile horse archers provided supporting fire while remaining ready to pursue fleeing enemies or harass Roman formations attempting to regroup. The Roman legions at Mysice fought with their traditional discipline and tactical flexibility, forming the famous testudo formations that had conquered much of the known world. However, the flat terrain of northern Mesopotamia favoured cavalry operations, while the Sasanian numerical superiority in mounted troops negated many traditional Roman advantages. Gordian III's forces found themselves gradually compressed into an increasingly smaller defensive perimeter as wave after wave of Persian cavalry attacks prevented any effective counteroffensive. The battle's climax came when Shapur personally led a concentrated cavalry charge against the Roman centre, his distinctive royal banner visible above the melee as his bodyguard carved through the enemy ranks. Contemporary accounts describe the king wielding a jewelled sword while mounted on a massive Nisaean horse, its bronze-plated armour gleaming in the desert sun. Gordian III fell during this assault, struck down either by a Persian lance or trampled beneath the hooves of the advancing cavalry. His death effectively ended organised Roman resistance, as surviving legions retreated in disorder toward the relative safety of Antioch. The victory at Mesich provided Shapur with unprecedented prestige throughout the ancient world and substantial material rewards that would fund his subsequent building projects. The captured Roman treasury contained millions of denarii and gold and silver coins, while thousands of prisoners included skilled craftsmen, engineers and administrators who would contribute to Sasanian development projects. Perhaps most significantly, the battle demonstrated that Roman military supremacy was not invincible, encouraging other enemies of the empire to increase their own aggressive activities along different frontiers. Philip the Arab, who succeeded Gordian III as emperor, initially sought to restore Roman prestige through renewed military campaigns against the Sasanians. However, the practical realities of governing an empire facing multiple simultaneous threats soon forced him to adopt a more pragmatic approach. The Gothic invasions along the Danube frontier, combined with increasing pressure from Germanic tribes along the Rhine, meant that Rome could not afford to maintain large armies in the east indefinitely. Philip's eventual peace negotiations with Shapur resulted in substantial Roman territorial concessions and the payment of enormous tribute amounts that further enriched the Sasanian treasury. The influx of Roman gold and the incorporation of skilled craftsmen from the Western Empire enabled Shapur to undertake building projects that surpassed even the magnificent constructions of ancient Persepolis. The most ambitious of these ventures involved the founding of entirely new cities designed to showcase Sasanian power and provide administrative centres for newly conquered territories. Bishapur, established in Fars province around 266 AD, represented the pinnacle of Sasanian urban planning and architectural achievement. The city's layout reflected both practical administrative needs and symbolic imperial ideology. Broad avenues radiating outward from a central palace complex created sightlines that emphasized royal authority while facilitating the movement of troops and official processions. The palace itself incorporated architectural elements from multiple cultural traditions, combining traditional Persian columned halls with Roman-style mosaics and Syrian decorative techniques. The throne room featured a massive barrel vault supported by intricately carved stone columns, their capitals decorated with images of royal hunts and divine investiture scenes. Bishapur's residential districts demonstrated sophisticated urban planning principles that provided for different social classes while maintaining overall architectural harmony. Wealthy merchants and government officials occupied spacious houses built around central courtyards, their walls decorated with elaborate stucco reliefs depicting mythological scenes and royal victories. Artisan quarters featured smaller but well-constructed buildings that housed the skilled workers responsible for producing the luxury goods that made Sasanian cities famous throughout the ancient world. Even the poorest residential areas included public fountains, bathhouses and markets that provided residents with amenities superior to those available in many Roman provincial cities. The city's defensive fortifications incorporated lessons learned from recent military campaigns against Roman positions. Massive walls constructed from carefully fitted stone blocks rose over 40 feet above the surrounding plain, their surfaces angled to deflect siege projectiles while providing optimal fields of fire for defending archers. Towers positioned at regular intervals along the wall's length housed catapults and ballistas capable of engaging enemy forces at considerable distances. The main gates featured complex entrance systems with multiple portcullises and murder holes that would channel attacking forces into killing zones where defenders could concentrate their fire. Bishapur's commercial districts reflected the expanding trade networks that connected the Sasanian Empire to markets throughout Asia and the Mediterranean world. Covered bazaars protected merchants and customers from the harsh Persian sun while providing security for valuable goods transported along the Silk Road. Warehouses near the city gates stored silk from China, spices from India, and precious stones from Central Asia, while local workshops produced the metalwork, textiles, and jewellery that Persian artisans had perfected over centuries of cultural development. The founding of Bishapur coincided with renewed military campaigns that would culminate in Shapur's greatest triumph over Roman forces. Emperor Valerian, who had assumed power during one of Rome's most turbulent periods, decided that decisive action against the Sasanians was necessary to restore imperial prestige and secure the eastern frontier. His preparations for this campaign involved assembling the largest Roman army sent against Persia since the time of Trajan, with legions drawn from across the empire and supported by auxiliary units from allied kingdoms. Valerian's army included approximately 70,000 troops organised into traditional legionary formations, but equipped with improved armour and weapons designed specifically for eastern warfare. The emperor had learned from previous Roman defeats, incorporating more cavalry units and siege equipment suitable for operations in the open terrain of Mesopotamia. His logistics train included hundreds of supply wagons and a substantial engineering corps capable of constructing field fortifications and siege works. The campaign began promisingly for Roman forces, with several early victories that recaptured cities lost during previous Sasanian advances. Valerian's methodical approach to territorial recovery initially caught Shapur off guard, as the Persian king had expected another hasty Roman offensive that could be defeated through superior mobility and tactical flexibility. The emperor's systematic restoration of Roman positions in northern Mesopotamia forced Shapur to abandon his preferred strategy of rapid cavalry strikes in favour of more conventional military confrontations. The decisive moment came near the city of Edessa in 260 AD, where both armies converged after months of manoeuvring and smaller engagements. The battle began with traditional cavalry skirmishes as both sides tested their opponent's strength and disposition. Sasanian horse archers, riding the swift horses bred in the Iranian highlands, launched clouds of arrows at Roman formations while remaining beyond the effective range of enemy projectiles. The Romans responded with their own cavalry units and auxiliary archers, creating a swirling melee of mounted warriors across the dusty plain. Shapur's tactical masterstroke involved a feigned retreat that drew the Roman cavalry into pursuing what appeared to be defeated Persian forces. As Valerian's horsemen advanced in disorder, believing they had achieved a breakthrough, concealed Sasanian cataphracts emerged from positions behind low hills and struck the Romans in the flank. The impact of this coordinated charge, executed by heavily armoured cavalry wielding long lances, shattered the Roman mounted units and created a gap in their battle line. The collapse of Roman cavalry exposed their infantry formations to direct assault by the main body of Sasanian forces. Persian elephants imported from India and trained specifically for battlefield operations led the advance against the Roman legions. These massive animals, protected by bronze armour and carrying towers filled with archers, created panic among Roman troops who had little experience fighting such exotic opponents. The psychological impact of the elephant charge proved as devastating as its physical effects, as disciplined legionaries broke ranks and fled rather than face the approaching giants. Emperor Valerian's capture during the battle represented an unprecedented humiliation for Roman arms, and provided Shapur with a propaganda victory of immense proportions. Contemporary accounts described the emperor's seizure by Sasanian cavalry as his bodyguard collapsed under the weight of Persian attacks. The sight of a Roman emperor in chains sent shockwaves throughout the ancient world and demonstrated the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred since the early days of Roman expansion into Asia. The aftermath of Edessa saw Shapur's forces advancing deeper into Roman territory than any Persian army since the time of Xerxes. Syrian cities opened their gates without resistance, while Roman garrisons abandoned their positions rather than face the victorious Sasanian army. Antioch, one of the empire's most important eastern cities, fell after minimal resistance, providing the Persians with enormous quantities of gold, silver and luxury goods. The city's capture also yielded thousands of skilled craftsmen and intellectuals who would contribute to Sasanian cultural development for decades to come. Shapur's treatment of captured territories reflected the sophisticated administrative principles that distinguished Sasanian rule from earlier Persian conquests. Rather than simply looting conquered cities and withdrawing, the king established permanent administrative structures designed to integrate new territories into the imperial system. Local elites who demonstrated loyalty to the new regime received confirmation of their authority, while those who resisted faced exile or execution. This selective approach to collaboration encouraged cooperation from Roman provincial populations who had grown weary of the instability characterizing the crisis of the 3rd century. The enormous wealth captured during these Western campaigns funded an unprecedented expansion of Zoroastrian religious infrastructure throughout the empire. Shapur commissioned the construction of hundreds of new fire temples, each designed to serve as both spiritual center and administrative headquarters for the surrounding region. These religious complexes featured sacred flames that burned continuously, tended by professional priests who also maintained records of births, deaths, marriages and property transfers within their jurisdictions. Cartier's influence reached its zenith during this period as the chief priest leveraged royal military successes to expand Zoroastrian authority throughout Sasanian territories. The priest's reforms standardized religious practices across the empire while eliminating competing cults that had flourished under the more tolerant Parthian system. Christian communities, which had begun establishing themselves in major Persian cities, faced systematic persecution designed to eliminate potential sources of disloyalty to the Zoroastrian state. The religious reforms implemented during Shapur's reign created a unified ideological framework that strengthened imperial cohesion while providing justification for continued territorial expansion. Official doctrine portrayed the king as the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, responsible for defending the forces of light against the darkness represented by Rome and other foreign enemies. This cosmic struggle provided religious sanction for military campaigns while encouraging popular support for royal policies. Shapur's artistic patronage during this golden age produced some of the most magnificent examples of Sasanian royal art ever created. The rock reliefs carved at Naksh-er-Rustam, near the ancient Achaemenid capital of Persepolis, commemorated his military victories while establishing visual connections to Iran's imperial past. These massive stone carvings, hewn from the living rock face of a cliff, depicted the king receiving divine investiture from Ahura Mazda while trampling defeated Roman emperors beneath his horse's hooves. The relief depicting Valerian's capture represents perhaps the finest example of Sasanian royal propaganda art. Carved in exquisite detail, the scene shows Shapur mounted on his warhorse while grasping the kneeling Roman emperor by the hair. The king's elaborate crown, decorated with the distinctive corimbos that symbolized divine authority, towers above the humiliated Roman ruler, whose imperial regalia contrasts sharply with his submissive posture. Surrounding figures include Sasanian nobles and captured Roman standards, emphasizing the complete reversal of fortune that the battle had achieved. Similar reliefs at Bishapur expanded upon these themes, while incorporating architectural elements that created immersive environments for royal ceremonies. The famous investiture relief shows Shapur receiving the Ring of Power from Ahura Mazda while standing upon the prostrate body of Gordian III. The artistic technique demonstrates remarkable sophistication, with flowing drapery, detailed facial features, and precise anatomical proportions that rival the finest examples of classical sculpture. These monumental artworks served multiple functions within Sasanian imperial ideology. They provided visual confirmation of royal divine sanction for subjects who might be unable to read official inscriptions, while simultaneously intimidating foreign visitors with displays of Persian power and cultural sophistication. The strategic placement of reliefs near major travel routes ensured maximum visibility for merchants, diplomats, and other travellers who would carry reports of Sasanian magnificence to distant lands. The cultural flowering that accompanied Shapur's military successes extended beyond monumental art to encompass literature, music, and scholarly pursuits that enriched Persian civilization. The Royal Library at Ctesiphon accumulated manuscripts from across the known world, including Greek philosophical works, Indian mathematical treatises, and Chinese technical manuals that Sasanian scholars translated into Middle Persian. This intellectual synthesis created new forms of knowledge that influenced fields ranging from astronomy to medicine. Sasanian court music during this period incorporated instruments and melodic traditions from conquered territories, while maintaining distinctively Persian characteristics. The royal orchestra included traditional Persian instruments like the barbat and chang alongside Roman lyres and Indian drums, creating complex musical arrangements that accompanied elaborate court ceremonies. Professional musicians, many recruited from captured populations, developed new compositional techniques that would influence musical traditions throughout the Middle East for centuries to come. The magnificent court ceremonies that had defined Shapur's final years came to an abrupt end in 272 AD, when the great king succumbed to illness at his palace in Ctesiphon. His death created an immediate succession crisis that would expose fundamental weaknesses in the Sasanian political system, despite the empire's unprecedented military and cultural achievements. The elaborate funeral processions that carried Shapur's body to the royal necropolis at Naksh-e-Rustam could not mask the uncertainty surrounding the imperial succession as competing claimants emerged from within the extended royal family. Hormizd I, Shapur's eldest son, ascended the throne amid considerable controversy over his legitimacy and capacity to rule. Contemporary sources describe him as a physically imposing figure who had inherited his father's commanding presence. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, with the distinctive Sasanian aquiline nose and piercing dark eyes that seemed to penetrate the souls of those who approached the throne. However, his brief reign of barely 1 year revealed significant limitations in both political acumen and administrative competence that contrasted sharply with his father's masterful governance. The new king faced immediate challenges from regional governors who had grown accustomed to the substantial autonomy they had enjoyed during Shapur's frequent military campaigns. These provincial administrators, many of whom controlled vast territories and commanded their own military forces, viewed the succession crisis as an opportunity to expand their influence within the imperial system. Several governors in the eastern provinces began withholding tax revenues while others delayed responses to royal commands, testing the new monarch's ability to enforce central authority. Hormizd's attempts to assert control over these rebellious provinces revealed his inexperience in the complex political maneuvering that effective Sasanian governance required. His harsh demands for immediate compliance alienated potential allies among the nobility, while failing to intimidate the more powerful regional commanders who possessed sufficient military strength to resist royal pressure. The king's reliance on threats rather than diplomatic negotiation demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the delicate balance between central authority and provincial autonomy that his father had managed so skillfully. The economic strains resulting from Shapur's extensive building projects and military campaigns compounded the political difficulties facing the new regime. The enormous expenditures required to construct cities like Bishapur and maintain the vast military apparatus that had conquered Roman territories had depleted the royal treasury despite the substantial tribute payments extracted from defeated enemies. Provincial tax collection, already disrupted by administrative resistance, could not generate sufficient revenue to meet the empire's ongoing financial obligations. Religious tensions that had been suppressed during Shapur's victorious reign began surfacing as various groups within the empire sensed weakness in the central government. Christian communities, which had faced systematic persecution under the previous administration, began organising more openly while testing the new king's commitment to enforcing religious orthodoxy. Similarly, followers of various mystery cults and local deities who had been driven underground by Zoroastrian reforms started reasserting their traditional practices. Kartir, the powerful Zoroastrian high priest whose influence had grown enormously during Shapur's reign, recognised the dangerous implications of this religious revival for the ideological unity that underpinned Sasanian rule. The priest's extensive network of fire temples and religious administrators throughout the empire provided him with detailed intelligence about emerging threats to orthodox doctrine. His reports to Hormizd emphasized the urgent need for renewed religious persecution to prevent the complete collapse of the Zoroastrian state system that had been so carefully constructed over the previous 3 decades. The king's response to these religious challenges proved characteristically heavy-handed and ultimately counterproductive. Rather than implementing the sophisticated combination of persecution and incentives that had enabled his father to achieve religious conformity, Hormizd ordered indiscriminate arrests and executions that created martyrs while failing to eliminate the underlying sources of religious dissent. These brutal measures alienated moderate elements within religious minority communities who might have been willing to accept Sasanian rule in exchange for limited toleration. The most significant religious controversy of Hormizd's brief reign involved the treatment of Manichaean communities that had established themselves in several major Persian cities. Mani, the religion's founder, had received limited protection during Shapur's reign due to his philosophical sophistication and the international connections that his followers maintained with communities throughout the Roman Empire and Central Asia. However, the new king proved far less tolerant of religious diversity, viewing Manichaeanism as a potentially subversive foreign influence that threatened Zoroastrian orthodoxy. Hormizd's sudden death in 273 AD, possibly from poisoning administered by palace conspirators, brought his brother Bahram I to the throne amid even greater political instability. The new monarch faced the accumulated problems of his predecessor's failed policies while confronting additional challenges from ambitious relatives who questioned his right to rule. Bahram's physical appearance contrasted sharply with the imposing stature of previous Sasanian kings, as contemporary accounts describe him as shorter and more slightly built than his predecessors, with prematurely greying hair that suggested the enormous stress of governing during this turbulent period. The new king's first priority involved restoring central authority over the provincial governors who had effectively achieved independence during the succession crisis. Bahram's approach to this challenge demonstrated greater political sophistication than his brother had shown, combining military pressure with diplomatic incentives designed to encourage voluntary submission. He offered amnesty to governors who acknowledged royal authority while simultaneously preparing military campaigns against those who continued their resistance. Kartir's influence reached unprecedented heights during the early years of Bahram III's reign, as the high priest successfully positioned himself as the primary architect of religious policy throughout the empire. The priest's personal relationship with the new king, developed through years of collaboration during Shapur's reign, enabled him to implement comprehensive reforms designed to eliminate religious diversity and strengthen Zoroastrian orthodoxy. His systematic approach to religious persecution would have profound consequences for the empire's cultural development and international relations. The persecution of Mani and his followers represented the most dramatic manifestation of this religious campaign. Kartir's agents throughout the empire received detailed instructions for identifying and arresting Manichaean teachers, while local fire temple priests were ordered to report any suspicious religious activities within their jurisdictions. The high priest's personal involvement in these operations demonstrated the priority he placed on eliminating what he viewed as a dangerous theological threat to Zoroastrian supremacy. Mani's arrest in 276 AD occurred at the royal court in Ctesiphon, where the religious teacher had come seeking an audience with Bahram I to defend his doctrines against Kartir's accusations of heresy. Contemporary accounts describe the dramatic confrontation between the Manichaean prophet and the Zoroastrian high priest, with both men presenting elaborate theological arguments before the assembled court. Kartir's accusations focused on Mani's dualistic cosmology, which the priest claimed undermined the supreme authority of Ahura Mazda by attributing equal power to the forces of darkness. The religious debate that preceded Mani's condemnation revealed the sophisticated theological knowledge that characterized educated Persian society during this period. Both participants demonstrated familiarity with Greek philosophical traditions, Indian religious concepts, and traditional Iranian mythology, creating complex arguments that impressed even their opponents with their intellectual rigor. However, the political context of the confrontation predetermined its outcome, as Bahram I could not afford to appear weak in the face of Kartir's demands for religious orthodoxy. Mani's execution following 26 days of imprisonment sent shockwaves throughout the international religious community and demonstrated the Sasanian government's commitment to enforcing Zoroastrian supremacy. The prophet's death by flaying, a particularly brutal form of execution, reserved for the most serious religious crimes, was intended to discourage other potential heretics while satisfying Kartir's demands for exemplary punishment. The gruesome spectacle, conducted in the main square of Ctesiphon before thousands of spectators, achieved its intended psychological impact while creating a lasting symbol of religious persecution. The systematic persecution of Manichaean communities throughout the empire followed Mani's execution as Kartir's agents implemented comprehensive measures designed to eliminate all traces of the religion. Fire temple priests received authority to conduct house-to-house searches for Manichaean texts and religious artifacts, while local administrators were ordered to compile lists of suspected adherents. These operations resulted in thousands of arrests and executions, as the Zoroastrian hierarchy demonstrated its determination to achieve complete religious conformity. The religious persecution extended beyond Manichaeanism to encompass other minority faiths that Kartir viewed as threats to orthodox doctrine. Christian communities faced renewed harassment as fire temple priests denounced their theological teachings and accused them of maintaining treasonous correspondence with Roman religious authorities. These religious policies created significant diplomatic complications for the Sasanian Empire, particularly in its relations with Roman territories where persecuted religious minorities had established extensive networks. Christian refugees fleeing Sasanian persecution provided Roman authorities with valuable intelligence about Persian military preparations and administrative weaknesses, while also generating anti-Persian propaganda that complicated any potential peace negotiations between the two empires. Bahram I's domestic policies faced increasing challenges as the economic costs of religious persecution combined with ongoing military expenditures to create serious fiscal problems. The disruption of trade networks caused by the harassment of merchant communities reduced customs revenues, while the resources required to maintain Kartir's extensive religious bureaucracy placed additional strains on the royal treasury. Provincial governors began reporting difficulties in meeting their tax obligations as local economies struggled with the effects of religious and political instability. The king's attempts to address these economic problems through increased taxation provoked resistance from noble families who had traditionally supported the Sasanian regime. These aristocratic houses, many of which traced their ancestry to the original supporters of Ardashir I, possessed substantial independent resources and could effectively resist royal demands when they chose to do so. The growing opposition to Bahram's policies created a dangerous political coalition that threatened the stability of the central government. Military challenges compounded the domestic difficulties facing Bahram's administration, as Roman forces began probing Persian positions along the Mesopotamian frontier. Emperor Carus, seeking to restore Roman prestige following the humiliations of the previous decade, organised substantial expeditionary forces designed to recapture territories lost during Shapur III's campaigns. The Roman military preparations included improved siege equipment and tactical innovations specifically developed for warfare against Persian cavalry forces. The Roman offensive that began in 283 AD achieved several early successes that exposed the weakened condition of Sasanian border defences. Carus's forces recaptured Carrhae after a brief siege, while other Roman units advanced along the Euphrates River toward the major Persian stronghold at Ctesiphon itself. These military setbacks created panic within the Sasanian court, and raised serious questions about Bahram's capacity to defend the empire's territorial integrity. Bahram's response to the Roman invasion revealed both his military limitations and the broader problems facing the Sasanian Empire during this period of internal strife. The king's attempts to mobilize effective resistance were hampered by the reluctance of several provincial governors to provide their full military support, while the resources required to maintain Kartir's religious persecution campaign limited the funds available for military operations. The traditional Sasanian advantages in cavalry warfare proved insufficient to overcome these systemic weaknesses. The unexpected death of Emperor Carus during the Roman advance towards Ctesiphon provided temporary relief for the beleaguered Sasanian regime, but the underlying military and political problems remained unresolved. Bahram's failure to achieve a decisive victory against Roman forces that had penetrated deep into Persian territory damaged royal prestige, while encouraging further resistance from disaffected provincial governors and noble families. The growing opposition to Bahram III's rule culminated in a serious rebellion, led by his own brother Hormizd, who had been serving as governor of the eastern provinces. This internal conflict represented more than a simple dynastic dispute, as it reflected fundamental disagreements about religious policy, administrative structure, and the empire's strategic priorities. Hormizd's rebellion attracted support from nobles who opposed Kartir's religious persecution, merchants who had suffered from the disruption of trade networks, and military commanders who questioned the king's strategic competence. The civil war that erupted in 293 AD divided the Sasanian Empire along regional and ideological lines, while providing opportunities for external enemies to exploit Persian weaknesses. Roman forces renewed their offensive operations along the western frontier, while nomadic tribes from Central Asia began raiding the empire's northeastern territories. These multiple, simultaneous threats stretched Sasanian military resources beyond their capacity and created a crisis that threatened the dynasty's survival. Bahram's death in 293 AD, whether from natural causes or assassination, ended his troubled reign but failed to resolve the fundamental problems that had plagued his administration. His son Bahram II inherited a fractured empire facing military defeat, economic collapse, and religious upheaval that would require extraordinary leadership to overcome. The new king's accession occurred amid continuing civil war, as various claimants to the throne competed for control over the remnants of Shapur II's once mighty empire. The succession of Bahram II marked a crucial turning point in Sasanian history, as the empire's survival depended on the new monarch's ability to restore internal unity while defending against external threats. The young king, barely 25 years old at his accession, possessed neither the military experience nor the political connections that effective governance required during such turbulent circumstances. His physical appearance, described by contemporary sources as resembling his grandfather Shapur in height and bearing, provided some symbolic continuity with the dynasty's golden age, but could not compensate for his lack of practical experience. The new king's initial attempts to end the civil war through negotiation with his uncle Hormizd revealed the complex factional divisions that had developed within the Sasanian elite during the previous 2 decades. Hormizd's supporters included many of the Empire's most capable military commanders and administrators, while also encompassing religious minorities who hoped for relief from Kartir's persecution policies. These diverse coalition partners shared little beyond their opposition to the previous regime's failures, creating potential instability within the rebel movement. Bahram II's decision to continue his father's alliance with Kartir proved particularly controversial, as it signalled his intention to maintain the religious persecution policies that had contributed significantly to the Empire's internal problems. The High Priest's continued influence over royal policy alienated potential supporters who might otherwise have been willing to accept the new king's authority in exchange for religious toleration. This strategic miscalculation prolonged the civil war, while preventing the national reconciliation that the Empire desperately needed. The military campaigns that characterized the early years of Bahram II's reign demonstrated both the resilience of Sasanian military traditions and the limitations imposed by internal division. Royal forces achieved several tactical victories against rebel armies, particularly in engagements where traditional Persian cavalry advantages could be fully exploited. However, these battlefield successes failed to translate into strategic gains, as Hormizd's forces retained control over key territorial bases and continued to attract new supporters from disaffected populations. The prolonged nature of the civil war created opportunities for a new claimant to emerge from within the extended royal family. Narseh, a son of Shapur I who had been governing Armenia during the previous conflicts, began positioning himself as a compromise candidate who could unite the various factions that had been fighting for control of the empire. His reputation for administrative competence and military skill, combined with his direct descent from the dynasty's greatest king, made him an attractive alternative to the feuding brothers who had brought the empire to the brink of collapse. Narseh's emergence as a unifying force within the fractured Sasanian Empire coincided with a dramatic shift in the balance of power that would define Persian-Roman relations for the next century. His victory over the feuding claimants in 293 AD brought an experienced administrator to the throne at a moment when the empire faced its gravest external threats since the Arab conquests of the 7th century. The new king, now in his 50s with greying hair and the weathered features of a career military commander, possessed the strategic acumen necessary to navigate the complex diplomatic and military challenges that awaited him. The Roman Empire under Diocletian had undergone its own transformation during the Sasanian Civil War, emerging from the crisis of the 3rd century with reformed military structures and renewed territorial ambitions. The establishment of the Tetrarchy had created multiple centres of imperial authority, each capable of mounting independent military operations while coordinating strategic objectives across vast distances. This administrative innovation enabled Rome to maintain pressure on multiple frontiers simultaneously, a capability that previous emperors had lacked during their confrontations with unified Persian forces. Galerius, appointed as Caesar in the Eastern Territories, brought fresh energy and tactical innovation to Roman military operations along the Mesopotamian frontier. Unlike his predecessors who had relied primarily on traditional legionary formations, Galerius incorporated substantial cavalry units and mobile artillery that could match Sasanian tactical flexibility. His army included Illyrian horsemen renowned for their skill with composite bows, Germanic auxiliaries experienced in rapid movement across difficult terrain, and specialized siege engineers capable of reducing the strongest Persian fortifications. The initial confrontation between Narseh and Galerius occurred near the ancient city of Callinicum in 296 AD, where both armies had converged after months of preliminary maneuvering along the Euphrates frontier. The battle demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred in both military systems since the great campaigns of Shapur I's era. Sasanian forces deployed in more flexible formations that could respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions, while Roman units demonstrated improved coordination between infantry and cavalry elements. Narses' army reflected the military reforms he had implemented during his governorship of Armenia, incorporating lessons learned from decades of frontier warfare against both Roman and nomadic opponents. His heavy cavalry retained the traditional cataphract equipment of scale armour and long lances, but operated in smaller, more manoeuvrable units that could concentrate quickly against enemy weak points. Supporting horse archers used improved composite bows with greater range and penetrating power, while infantry formations included specialised troops trained in siege warfare and urban combat. The Roman deployment at Callinicum revealed Galerius' understanding of Persian tactical preferences and his determination to neutralise traditional Sasanian advantages. He positioned his legions in defensive formations designed to absorb cavalry charges while maintaining sufficient reserves to exploit breakthrough opportunities. Auxiliary archers provided covering fire from elevated positions, while mobile ballista units could engage Persian cavalry at extended ranges. The Roman cavalry, positioned on the flanks, included both heavy and light units capable of responding to different tactical situations. The battle's opening phase featured the traditional cavalry skirmishing that had characterized Persian-Roman engagements for centuries, but with tactical innovations that reflected the military evolution both empires had undergone. Sasanian horse archers employed new shooting techniques that maximized their weapons' effectiveness while minimizing exposure to enemy projectiles. Roman auxiliary cavalry responded with coordinated charges designed to disrupt Persian formations before they could achieve optimal firing positions. Narses' tactical masterstroke involved a complex maneuver that drew Roman forces into a carefully prepared killing ground where concealed Persian units could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The king personally led a feigned retreat that convinced Galerius his cavalry charges had achieved a breakthrough in the Sasanian centre. As Roman units advanced in pursuit of what appeared to be fleeing enemies, they found themselves trapped between converging Persian forces that had been positioned specifically for this contingency. The collapse of Roman tactical cohesion occurred with devastating suddenness, as Sasanian cataphracts emerged from concealed positions behind low ridges and struck the advancing Romans in both flanks. The impact of these coordinated charges, executed by heavily armoured cavalry wielding 12-foot lances, shattered multiple Roman formations and created gaps in their battle line that Persian reserves quickly exploited. Galerius himself narrowly escaped capture when his bodyguard was overwhelmed by pursuing Sasanian horsemen. The victory at Callinicum restored Sasanian prestige throughout the region, while providing Narses with substantial material rewards that helped stabilize his recently unified kingdom. Captured Roman equipment included advanced siege engines and military engineering tools that Persian craftsmen quickly adapted for their own use. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that the reformed Sasanian military could compete effectively with Rome's improved forces, encouraging regional allies who had wavered during the recent civil war period. However, Galerius' response to his defeat revealed the strategic advantages that the tetrarchy system provided to Roman military operations. Rather than accepting the tactical setback as a permanent strategic defeat, he immediately began preparations for a renewed offensive that would incorporate lessons learned from the recent engagement. His access to reinforcements from multiple imperial territories enabled him to replace his losses while simultaneously expanding his army's overall strength. The Roman counteroffensive that began in 298 AD involved forces drawn from across the Eastern Empire and represented one of the most systematic military preparations in Roman history. Galerius assembled approximately 80,000 troops organised into both traditional legionary formations and new combined arms units designed specifically for operations against Persian cavalry forces. His logistics train included hundreds of supply wagons, mobile workshops for equipment maintenance, and specialised medical units that could treat battlefield casualties more effectively than previous Roman armies. Armenian territories became the primary theatre for this renewed conflict, as both empires recognized the strategic importance of controlling the mountain passes that connected the Iranian plateau to Anatolia. The region's complex political situation, with local nobles maintaining shifting loyalties between Persian and Roman patrons, created opportunities for both sides to exploit internal divisions while complicating military operations through the constant threat of local betrayal. Narses' defensive strategy in Armenia demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of the terrain's tactical possibilities and the political dynamics that influenced local populations. Rather than attempting to hold fixed positions that Roman siege capabilities could eventually overcome, he deployed mobile forces that could strike at enemy supply lines while avoiding decisive engagements under unfavourable conditions. This approach required extensive coordination with Armenian nobles who could provide intelligence about Roman movements while offering secure bases for Persian operations. The mountain warfare that characterized this campaign differed significantly from the open field battles that had defined previous Persian-Roman conflicts. Narrow valleys and steep slopes negated many traditional cavalry advantages, while favouring infantry formations capable of fighting in broken terrain. Both armies adapted their tactical doctrines to accommodate these environmental constraints, developing new techniques for mountain combat that would influence military thinking for generations. Galerius's breakthrough came through a combination of tactical innovation and diplomatic success that enabled his forces to achieve decisive advantages in multiple theatres simultaneously. His negotiations with disaffected Armenian princes provided Roman forces with detailed intelligence about Persian defensive positions, while opening alternative routes through the mountain passes. These political gains complemented military improvements that enhanced Roman capabilities in the challenging terrain of the Armenian highlands. The decisive engagement occurred near the fortress city of Satala in 298 AD, where Narse had concentrated his forces to defend the primary route connecting Armenia to the Iranian plateau. The battle demonstrated both the tactical evolution that had occurred in mountain warfare and the strategic importance of controlling key geographical positions. Persian forces, positioned on elevated terrain that maximized their defensive advantages, initially repelled Roman attacks while inflicting substantial casualties on the advancing legions. Galerius's tactical solution involved a complex flanking maneuver that utilized secondary mountain paths to position Roman forces behind Persian defensive lines. This operation required exceptional coordination between multiple army units operating across difficult terrain while maintaining communication through visual signals and mounted messengers. The successful execution of this maneuver demonstrated the improved training and discipline that characterized the reformed Roman military system. The collapse of Persian resistance at Satala occurred when Roman forces attacking from multiple directions simultaneously overwhelmed Narse's ability to coordinate effective defensive responses. The king's personal household troops, fighting desperately to protect the royal standard, were gradually compressed into an increasingly smaller defensive perimeter as Roman units converged from different mountain approaches. Narse himself escaped capture only through the sacrifice of his bodyguard, who fought to the death while their king fled toward the safety of Persian territories. The Roman victory's most significant consequence involved the capture of Narse's family members, including his wives, children, and extensive royal household. These prisoners represented invaluable diplomatic assets that Galerius could leverage in subsequent peace negotiations, while simultaneously humiliating Persian royal prestige. The sight of Sasanian royal women in Roman custody sent shockwaves throughout the Persian Empire and demonstrated the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred since Shapur I's capture of Valerian 4 decades earlier. Galerius's advance following the victory at Satala penetrated deeper into Persian territory than any Roman army since the campaigns of Trajan nearly 2 centuries earlier. Armenian and Mesopotamian cities that had been under Sasanian control for generations opened their gates to Roman forces rather than face siege warfare. The systematic nature of Roman territorial recovery demonstrated both the effectiveness of Diocletian's military reforms and the weakened condition of Persian border defences following decades of internal strife. The peace negotiations that began in 299 AD reflected the dramatically altered balance of power between the two empires, while establishing diplomatic precedents that would influence Persian-Roman relations for the remainder of the classical period. Narse, operating from a position of military weakness but possessing extensive diplomatic experience, sought to minimize territorial losses while preserving core Sasanian interests in Armenia and Mesopotamia. His negotiating strategy emphasized the mutual benefits of stable frontier arrangements, while warning of the regional instability that would result from excessive Roman territorial demands. Diocletian's personal involvement in the peace negotiations demonstrated the priority he placed on achieving a comprehensive settlement that would secure Rome's eastern frontier for an extended period. The emperor's diplomatic approach balanced territorial acquisitions with practical considerations about the costs of administering newly conquered regions. His experience governing diverse populations throughout the empire informed his understanding of the challenges involved in integrating Persian territories into the Roman administrative system. The Treaty of Nisibis, concluded in 299 AD, established territorial and diplomatic arrangements that would remain largely intact for over 60 years. Roman territorial gains included significant portions of Armenia and northern Mesopotamia, with the frontier moved eastward to positions that provided better defensive advantages for Roman forces. The treaty's commercial provisions reopened trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare while establishing regulatory frameworks for cross-border commerce. The treaty's most innovative feature involved the establishment of formal diplomatic protocols for managing Armenian affairs, recognizing the region's strategic importance to both empires while creating mechanisms for preventing future conflicts. These arrangements acknowledged Armenian autonomy within defined spheres, while establishing procedures for resolving disputes that might arise between competing imperial interests. The diplomatic framework created by these provisions would serve as a model for subsequent international agreements throughout the ancient world. Narse's acceptance of the treaty's terms reflected both his realistic assessment of Persian military capabilities and his strategic vision for the empire's long-term recovery. The territorial losses, while substantial, did not threaten core Persian interests in the Iranian plateau or the empire's access to Central Asian trade routes. More importantly, the peace settlement provided the stability necessary for internal reconstruction following decades of civil war and external conflict. The implementation of the treaty's provisions required extensive administrative coordination between Roman and Persian officials as both empires established new frontier arrangements and commercial relationships. Roman engineers constructed improved fortifications along the adjusted border, while Persian administrators reorganized provincial boundaries to accommodate territorial changes. These practical arrangements created ongoing diplomatic contacts that helped maintain peaceful relations despite occasional tensions over specific implementation details. The death of Narse in 302 AD brought his son Hormizd II to the throne during a period of relative stability that contrasted sharply with the chaos that had characterized recent Sasanian history. The new king, described by contemporary sources as possessing his father's diplomatic skills, combined with greater military ambition, inherited an empire that had achieved internal unity while maintaining peaceful relations with its primary external rival. His early reign focused on internal development projects designed to restore the prosperity that had characterized Shapur I's golden age. Hormizd II's domestic policies emphasized economic recovery through the restoration of trade networks and agricultural productivity that had been disrupted by decades of warfare and political instability. His administrators implemented tax reforms designed to encourage commercial activity while providing sufficient revenue for essential government functions. The reconstruction of damaged cities and irrigation systems demonstrated royal commitment to material prosperity while creating employment opportunities for populations that had suffered from prolonged conflict. The king's religious policies reflected lessons learned from the divisive persecution campaigns that had characterized previous reigns. While maintaining official support for Zoroastrian orthodoxy, Hormizd II adopted a more tolerant approach toward religious minorities that reduced internal tensions while preserving ideological unity. This moderate policy attracted support from merchant communities and urban populations who valued stability above doctrinal purity. However, the relative peace that characterized the early years of Hormizd II's reign would not survive the succession crisis that erupted following his premature death in 309 AD. The king's infant son, Shapur II, inherited the throne under circumstances that recalled the instability of previous succession periods. Though the Regency Council established to govern during his minority possessed greater experience and unity than earlier transitional administrations had achieved. The Regency period that began in 309 AD established administrative precedents that would influence Sasanian governmental practices for generations. The council's members, drawn from the empire's most experienced administrators and military commanders, implemented collective decision-making procedures that balanced competing interests while maintaining effective governance. Their success in preserving internal stability during a potentially vulnerable period demonstrated the institutional maturity that the Sasanian Empire had achieved despite its recent turbulent history. Shapur II's childhood occurred during a period of renewed Roman territorial expansion under Constantine I, whose conversion to Christianity added religious dimensions to the traditional geopolitical competition between the two empires. The Roman emperor's support for Christian communities throughout the Middle East created new diplomatic complications for the Sasanian government, while providing potential sources of internal subversion. These religious tensions would profoundly influence the military conflicts that would dominate Shapur II's adult reign. The young king's education, supervised by the Regency Council, emphasized both traditional Persian royal accomplishments and practical skills necessary for effective imperial governance. His tutors included veteran military commanders who had served under Naseh, experienced administrators familiar with complex diplomatic negotiations, and Zoroastrian priests responsible for maintaining ideological orthodoxy. This comprehensive educational program prepared him for the extraordinary challenges that would define his unprecedented 70-year reign. The death of Shapur II in 379 AD marked the end of an era that had witnessed the Sasanian Empire's remarkable recovery from near collapse to renewed great power status. His 70-year reign had restored Persian military prestige through successful campaigns against Rome, while establishing administrative systems that could effectively govern territories stretching from the Euphrates to the Oxus River. However, the empire that Ardashir II inherited faced entirely new strategic challenges that would test Sasanian adaptability in ways that previous generations of rulers had never encountered. Along the northeastern frontiers of the empire, nomadic confederations were coalescing into formidable military forces that possessed both the mobility to strike deep into Persian territory and the organizational sophistication to sustain prolonged campaigns far from their traditional grazing lands. The Kedarite Huns, emerging from the steppes beyond the Oxus, represented the vanguard of a massive population movement that would reshape the political geography of Central Asia and threaten the stability of all settled civilizations along the Silk Road trade routes. These nomadic warriors differed significantly from the tribal raiders that previous Sasanian kings had encountered along their northern borders. The Kidarites possessed advanced metallurgical skills that enabled them to produce high-quality weapons and armor comparable to those manufactured in Persian workshops. Their composite bows, reinforced with horn and sinew according to techniques perfected on the steppes, could penetrate traditional scale armor at distances that exceeded the effective range of Persian archery. More ominously, their military organization incorporated tactical innovations learned from conflicts with Chinese armies. creating combined arms formations that coordinated cavalry charges with supporting infantry and siege equipment. Ardashir II's initial response to these emerging threats reflected the traditional Sasanian approach to frontier defence, emphasising the construction of fortified positions and the deployment of regular army units along established invasion routes. The king ordered the strengthening of existing border fortresses while commissioning new defensive works designed to channel nomadic raiders into predetermined killing zones where Persian advantages in heavy cavalry and siege warfare could be fully exploited. These preparations consumed enormous resources and required the redeployment of military units from western frontiers where Roman forces remained a constant potential threat. However, the nomadic invasion that materialized in 384 AD demonstrated the inadequacy of static defensive strategies against enemies who possess superior strategic mobility and intimate knowledge of alternative routes through the mountainous terrain separating the Iranian plateau from Central Asia. Khedrite forces bypassed the heavily fortified main passes, utilizing secondary trails known only to local guides who had been coerced or bribed into providing assistance. These infiltrating columns struck directly at Persian administrative centers and commercial cities, avoiding confrontation with border garrisons that had been positioned to defend against conventional invasion routes. The siege of Merv, the principal Persian stronghold in Khorasan province, revealed both the tactical sophistication of the Khedrite military system and the vulnerability of Sasanian frontier defences to unconventional warfare. The nomadic forces surrounding the city employed siege techniques that combined traditional steppe mobility with engineering skills acquired through contact with Chinese and Indian military traditions. Their siege engines, constructed from materials gathered during their advance through Persian territory, demonstrated remarkable adaptability in utilizing local resources for military purposes. The Khedrite army besieging Merv included approximately 40,000 warriors organized into decimal units that could operate independently while maintaining coordination through an elaborate system of horn signals and banner displays. Their cavalry forces rode the sturdy ponies bred on Central Asian steppes, animals capable of surviving on minimal forage while maintaining the endurance necessary for extended military campaigns. Each warrior carried multiple weapons, including composite bows, curved sabres, and long lances, enabling them to adapt their fighting techniques to different tactical situations. The siege operations demonstrated sophisticated understanding of urban warfare principles that contradicted Roman and Persian assumptions about nomadic military capabilities. Khedrite engineers constructed elaborate earthworks that protected their siege equipment while providing elevated platforms for archers and catapult operators. Their assault techniques coordinated simultaneous attacks on multiple sections of the city's walls, preventing defenders from concentrating their forces at any single threatened point. Persian resistance within Merv reflected the high quality of Sasanian military engineering and the determination of garrison troops who understood that defeat would result in the complete destruction of their city. The fortress walls, constructed from fired brick reinforced with iron bands, had been designed to withstand traditional siege warfare and initially proved effective against nomadic assault techniques. However, the prolonged nature of the siege gradually depleted the defenders' supplies, while the attackers maintained their strength through systematic foraging operations throughout the surrounding countryside. The fall of Merv after a 4-month siege sent shockwaves throughout the Sasanian Empire and demonstrated the inadequacy of existing frontier defense strategies. The city's capture provided the Khedrites with enormous quantities of Persian military equipment, administrative records that revealed the locations of other strategic targets, and thousands of skilled craftsmen who could contribute to nomadic military capabilities. More significantly, the victory established Khedrite credibility among other Central Asian tribes who had previously hesitated to challenge Persian authority. Ardashir II's death in 383 AD possibly hastened by the stress of confronting these unprecedented military challenges, brought Shapur III to the throne during one of the most dangerous periods in Sasanian history. The new king, barely 25 years old and lacking significant military experience, inherited an empire facing simultaneous threats from nomadic invasions in the east and renewed Roman pressure along western frontiers. His physical appearance, described by contemporary sources as resembling his grandfather Shapur II in height and bearing, provided some symbolic continuity with the dynasty's military traditions, but could not compensate for his inexperience in managing complex strategic challenges. The young king's advisors, drawn from the experienced administrators and military commanders who had served under previous rulers, advocated fundamentally different approaches to addressing the nomadic threat. Conservative elements within the court favoured traditional defensive strategies, emphasising the construction of additional fortifications and the deployment of larger garrison forces along threatened frontiers. Progressive advisors argued for tactical innovations that would enable Persian forces to match nomadic mobility while exploiting Sasanian advantages in equipment quality and logistical support. Shapur III's decision to adopt a more aggressive military posture reflected both his youthful ambition and the practical recognition that static defences had proven inadequate against nomadic infiltration tactics. His military reforms emphasised the development of mobile cavalry units that could respond quickly to intelligence reports about nomadic movements while maintaining sufficient striking power to achieve decisive victories in open field engagements. These new formations required extensive retraining of existing troops and the recruitment of additional personnel familiar with the fighting techniques necessary for steppe warfare. The reformed Sasanian cavalry incorporated tactical innovations borrowed from nomadic military traditions, while retaining the heavy armour and disciplined formations that had traditionally provided Persian forces with their battlefield advantages. New equipment included lighter armour that provided adequate protection, while reducing the weight burden that had previously limited Persian cavalry mobility. Improved horse breeding programs, utilising bloodlines acquired from captured nomadic mounts, produced animals capable of matching steppe ponies in endurance, while maintaining the size and strength necessary for shock combat. However, Shapur III's reign ended abruptly in 388 AD, when he was assassinated during a military campaign, possibly by nobles who opposed his military reforms or feared the costs associated with prolonged warfare against nomadic enemies. His brother Bahram IV inherited a throne surrounded by political intrigue and military challenges that threatened the empire's territorial integrity. The new king's cautious personality and preference for diplomatic solutions contrasted sharply with his predecessor's aggressive military policies, creating opportunities for enemies to exploit apparent Persian weakness. The succession of Bahram IV coincided with the emergence of even more formidable nomadic threats, as the Hephthalite Huns began consolidating their control over territories previously dominated by Kedarite forces. These new adversaries possessed superior military organisation and demonstrated greater strategic ambition than their predecessors, viewing the conquest of Persian territories as stepping stones toward the establishment of a nomadic empire encompassing all of Central Asia and much of the Middle East. Hephthalite military capabilities reflected the culmination of nomadic tactical evolution and the incorporation of siege techniques learned through conflicts with Chinese, Indian, and Persian armies. Their forces included specialized engineering units capable of constructing and operating complex siege equipment, while their cavalry formations demonstrated unprecedented coordination between different types of mounted troops. Most significantly, their political organization enabled them to sustain military operations across vast distances while maintaining effective communication and supply networks. The death of Bahram IV in 399 AD brought Yazdgerd I to the throne, during a period when nomadic pressure along eastern frontiers had reached crisis proportions. The new king, whose epithet the Sinner reflected later Zoroastrian disapproval of his religious policies, possessed the intellectual sophistication and diplomatic skills necessary to address the complex challenges facing his empire. His approach to the nomadic threat emphasized negotiation and tribute payments rather than military confrontation, recognizing that Persian resources were insufficient to achieve decisive victory against enemies who possessed significant advantages in strategic mobility. Yazdgerd's diplomatic initiatives with Hepthalite leaders produced temporary stabilization along eastern frontiers, while providing the empire with breathing space necessary for internal reconstruction and military reorganization. The tribute agreements negotiated during this period involved substantial annual payments in gold and luxury goods, but these costs proved more manageable than the enormous expenditures required to maintain large armies in constant readiness for nomadic invasions. The diplomatic settlements also established commercial relationships that provided Persian merchants with access to Central Asian trade routes that had been disrupted by warfare. However, these peaceful arrangements could not survive the succession crisis that followed Yazdgerd's death in 421 AD, when competing claimants to the throne created opportunities for nomadic leaders to exploit Persian internal divisions. Bahram V, known to history as Bahram Gur, emerged victorious from this succession struggle with the military support of Arab allies, who had been cultivated through his mother's Lakhmid connections. His rise to power marked the beginning of one of the most celebrated reigns in Sasanian history, though his early years were dominated by the necessity of addressing the nomadic threats that had grown more dangerous during the previous period of internal instability. Bahram V's legendary status in Persian literature and folklore reflects both his military achievements and his patronage of cultural activities that produce some of the finest examples of Sasanian art and poetry. Contemporary descriptions portray him as exceptionally tall and powerfully built, with the dark complexion inherited from his Arab maternal ancestry and the piercing gaze that characterized the Sasanian royal family. His physical prowess, demonstrated through his famous hunting expeditions and personal combat achievements, provided him with the military credibility necessary to command respect from both Persian nobles and foreign enemies. The king's approach to the nomadic threat combined military innovation with diplomatic sophistication, recognizing that neither strategy alone could achieve lasting success against enemies who possessed fundamental advantages in strategic mobility and tactical flexibility. His military reforms emphasized the development of combined arms formations that could coordinate infantry, cavalry, and artillery units in complex operations designed to neutralize nomadic advantages while exploiting Persian strengths in equipment quality and logistical support. The new Sasanian military doctrine developed during Bahram V's reign incorporated lessons learned from decades of conflict with nomadic enemies while adapting traditional Persian tactical principles to address the unique challenges of steppe warfare. Persian cavalry units received training in rapid deployment techniques that enabled them to respond quickly to nomadic raids, while maintaining the disciplined formations necessary for effective shock combat. Infantry formations learned to construct field fortifications that could provide secure bases for cavalry operations, while offering refuge during tactical withdrawals. Artillery innovations represented perhaps the most significant military development of this period, as Persian engineers developed portable siege equipment that could accompany mobile forces during extended campaigns in nomadic territories. These weapons included lightweight catapults that could be disassembled for transport, while retaining sufficient power to breach nomadic fortifications, and improved crossbows that provided infantry units with enhanced firepower against mounted opponents. The systematic deployment of these weapons created tactical advantages that helped offset nomadic superiority and strategic mobility. Bahram V's first major military campaign against the Hepthalites in 427 AD demonstrated both the effectiveness of these military innovations and the continuing challenges involved in achieving decisive victory against nomadic opponents. The Persian army that advanced into Central Asian territories included approximately 60,000 troops organised into flexible formations capable of adapting to different tactical situations while maintaining overall strategic coherence. The logistical support for this expedition required unprecedented coordination between multiple administrative departments and demonstrated the improved organisational capabilities that characterised the reformed Sasanian government. The campaign's initial phases achieved significant tactical successes as Persian forces systematically reduced Hepthalite strongholds that controlled access to important trade routes and strategic mountain passes. The Siege of Balkh, the principal Hepthalite administrative centre in the region, showcased the effectiveness of Persian combined arms tactics and the superior quality of Sasanian siege equipment. The city's elaborate fortifications, constructed according to nomadic engineering principles, proved inadequate against Persian assault techniques that coordinated artillery bombardment with infantry attacks and cavalry operations. However, the Hepthalite response to these initial defeats revealed the strategic depth and tactical flexibility that made nomadic opponents so formidable. Rather than attempting to defend fixed positions where Persian advantages could be fully exploited, Hepthalite forces withdrew into the vast steppes beyond the Oxus River while maintaining pressure on Persian supply lines through constant harassment attacks. This strategy forced Bahram V to extend his communications across increasingly dangerous territory, while preventing him from achieving the decisive battle that might have ended nomadic resistance. The protracted nature of the campaign gradually revealed the limitations of Persian logistical capabilities when operating at such distances from their territorial base. Supply convoys travelling from Iranian cities to the army's forward positions faced constant attacks from nomadic raiders who possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and could strike at vulnerable points before disappearing into the trackless steppes. These logistical difficulties forced Persian commanders to reduce their operational tempo while diverting significant military resources to convoy protection duties. Bahram IV's tactical solution involved the establishment of fortified supply bases at regular intervals along his army's line of communication, creating a network of strongholds that could provide security for supply operations while serving as rallying points during tactical emergencies. These installations required substantial garrison forces and engineering resources, but they enabled Persian forces to maintain effective operations at unprecedented distances from their homeland. The construction techniques employed in these fortifications incorporated lessons learned from nomadic siege warfare, while adapting traditional Persian defensive principles to local environmental conditions. The climactic battle of the campaign occurred near the ancient city of Talas in 428 AD, where Hepthalite forces finally accepted decisive engagement under circumstances that favoured their tactical preferences. The nomadic army, commanded by a leader whose name has been lost to history but whose tactical acumen rivaled that of the greatest steppe generals, deployed approximately 50,000 warriors in formations designed to maximise their mobility advantages while minimising exposure to Persian artillery fire. The engagement began with the traditional cavalry skirmishing that characterised steppe warfare, but quickly evolved into a complex tactical contest that demonstrated the military evolution both sides had undergone during decades of conflict. Hepthalite horse archers, riding in loose formations that could disperse quickly when threatened, launched clouds of arrows at Persian positions while remaining beyond the effective range of enemy projectiles. Persian cavalry responded with coordinated charges designed to disrupt nomadic formations before they could achieve optimal firing positions, creating a swirling melee of mounted warriors across the dusty plain. Bahram V's personal leadership during the battle's critical moments proved decisive in achieving Persian victory, as the king led a concentrated cavalry charge that broke through the Hepthalite centre at the moment when their tactical cohesion began to waver under sustained pressure. His distinctive royal banner, visible above the chaos of combat, provided a rallying point for Persian forces while demonstrating royal commitment to achieving victory regardless of personal risk. The sight of their king fighting in the front ranks inspired Persian troops to extraordinary efforts while demoralizing nomadic opponents who recognized the implications of facing such determined leadership. The Hepthalite collapse, when it came, occurred with startling suddenness as their carefully coordinated tactical formations disintegrated under the pressure of sustained Persian attacks. Nomadic units that had maintained disciplined cohesion throughout hours of combat suddenly broke and fled toward the safety of the distant steppes, abandoning their wounded comrades and much of their equipment in their haste to escape Persian pursuit. The victory provided Bahram V with enormous prestige throughout the ancient world, while demonstrating that nomadic military superiority was not invincible when confronted by properly organized and led Persian forces. The aftermath of Talas established Persian control over vast territories in Central Asia, while creating opportunities for the restoration of trade relationships that had been disrupted by decades of warfare. Bahram V's treatment of conquered populations reflected the sophisticated administrative principles that distinguished Sasanian rule from simple military occupation, as local leaders who demonstrated loyalty to the new regime received confirmation of their authority, while those who continued resistance faced exile or execution. This selective approach to collaboration encouraged cooperation from nomadic populations who had grown weary of constant warfare and valued the stability that Persian administration could provide. The enormous wealth captured during the Central Asian campaigns funded an unprecedented expansion of royal building projects and cultural patronage that would define Bahram V's reign in the historical memory of later generations. The king's architectural commissions included the construction of magnificent palaces that incorporated design elements from conquered territories while maintaining distinctively Persian characteristics, creating synthesis styles that influenced artistic development throughout the Middle East for centuries to come. The death of Perozlmer in 484 AD during his disastrous campaign against the Hepthalites left the Sasanian Empire in a state of unprecedented crisis. The king's body, trampled beneath the hooves of nomadic cavalry on the steppes beyond the Oxus River, symbolized the complete collapse of Persian military prestige and territorial integrity. His brother Balash assumed the throne amid circumstances that recalled the darkest periods of Sasanian history, inheriting an empire whose eastern provinces lay under Hepthalite occupation, while the royal treasury had been depleted by decades of unsuccessful military campaigns and tribute payments to nomadic overlords. The new king's physical frailty, described by contemporary sources as reflecting the exhaustion of the royal bloodline after generations of warfare and political stress, provided little inspiration for a population that had grown accustomed to the imposing presence of warrior kings like Bahram V Balash's thin frame and prematurely greying hair, contrasted sharply with the martial bearing that had characterized previous Sasanian monarchs, while his hesitant manner of speaking suggested uncertainty about his ability to address the enormous challenges confronting his realm. The immediate consequences of Peroz's defeat extended far beyond simple military setbacks to encompass fundamental disruptions in the social and economic structures that had sustained Sasanian civilization for over 2 centuries. The tribute payments demanded by Hepthalite overlords consumed revenues that had previously funded public works projects, military maintenance, and administrative operations throughout the empire. Provincial governors, deprived of adequate resources from the central treasury, began imposing additional taxes on local populations while reducing expenditures for essential services like road maintenance and irrigation system upkeep. Agricultural productivity, the foundation of Persian prosperity since Achaemenid times, suffered severe disruptions as nomadic raids penetrated deep into traditionally secure farming regions. The systematic destruction of irrigation canals and storage facilities by Hepthalite forces created food shortages that affected not only rural populations, but also the urban centres that depended on agricultural surpluses for their survival. Grain prices in major cities like Ctesiphon and Isfahan increased dramatically, creating hardships for artisans, merchants and government officials whose incomes remained fixed while their living costs escalated beyond manageable levels. The social tensions generated by these economic difficulties were compounded by the visible failure of traditional Zoroastrian explanations for imperial misfortunes. The fire temples that had served as centres of community life and royal ideology for generations could offer no convincing theological justification for the empire's humiliation at the hands of nomadic enemies who worshipped different deities and followed alien customs. The elaborate ceremonies that had once reinforced popular confidence in divine support for Sasanian rule now seemed hollow rituals that mocked the reality of Persian weakness and defeat. Religious dissatisfaction created opportunities for alternative spiritual movements that promised more effective solutions to the empire's problems than orthodox Zoroastrianism had provided. Christian communities, which had maintained underground networks despite periodic persecution, began attracting converts from among Persian populations who had lost faith in traditional religious authorities. More significantly, entirely new religious movements emerged that combined elements from various spiritual traditions while addressing the specific social and economic grievances that had been generated by the empire's recent disasters. The most influential of these new religious movements developed around the teachings of Mazdak, a Zoroastrian priest whose radical reinterpretation of traditional doctrine offered revolutionary solutions to the social inequalities that had been exacerbated by military defeats and economic hardship. Mazdak's background as a member of the established religious hierarchy provided him with intimate knowledge of orthodox theology and administrative procedures, enabling him to formulate critiques that possessed both intellectual sophistication and practical relevance to contemporary problems. Mazdak's physical appearance, according to surviving descriptions, embodied the ascetic ideals that characterized his religious movement. Tall and gaunt, with a pale complexion of someone who spent long hours in scholarly pursuits, he wore simple white robes that contrasted dramatically with the elaborate silk garments favoured by traditional Zoroastrian priests. His penetrating gaze and measured speaking style created an impression of spiritual authority that attracted followers from across the social spectrum, including members of the nobility who had grown disillusioned with conventional religious and political leadership. The theological foundation of Mazdakite doctrine rested on a radical reinterpretation of traditional Zoroastrian dualism that emphasized the social implications of the cosmic struggle between light and darkness. Mazdak taught that existing social inequalities represented manifestations of the evil principle's influence on human affairs, arguing that true followers of Ahura Mazda had a religious obligation to eliminate poverty, oppression, and material inequality from their communities. This theological framework provided religious justification for social reforms that challenged the fundamental structures of Sasanian society. The practical program that emerged from Mazdakite theology included proposals for the redistribution of private property, the communalization of agricultural resources, and the elimination of hereditary social distinctions that prevented capable individuals from achieving positions appropriate to their talents. These reforms addressed specific grievances that had developed among Persian populations during the recent period of military and economic crisis, offering concrete solutions to problems that traditional authorities had proven unable to resolve through conventional means. Mazdak's critique of existing property relationships focused particularly on the concentration of land ownership among noble families who had accumulated vast estates while ordinary farmers struggled with inadequate holdings and crushing debt burdens. The religious teacher argued that the earth belonged to all humanity as a divine gift from Ahura Mazda, making private monopolization of agricultural resources a form of theft that violated fundamental spiritual principles. This theological argument resonated powerfully with rural populations who had suffered disproportionately from the economic disruptions accompanying military defeats and tribute payments. The Mazdakite movement's appeal extended beyond rural communities to encompass urban artisans, small merchants, and lower-level government officials who had experienced declining living standards, while observing the continued prosperity of wealthy elites who seemed insulated from the empire's general misfortunes. The movement's egalitarian ideology offered these groups hope for social advancement and economic security that traditional political structures had failed to provide, creating a broad coalition of support that transcended conventional social boundaries. Balash's response to the growing Mazdakite movement reflected both his personal religious convictions and his practical recognition of the political dangers associated with widespread social unrest. The king's own theological training, acquired during his youth when he had been expected to pursue a religious career rather than inherit the throne, made him sympathetic to reform movements that claimed orthodox Zoroastrian inspiration. However, his dependence on noble support for maintaining political stability created constraints on his ability to endorse radical social changes that threatened established interests. The death of Balash in 488 AD, possibly from poisoning administered by nobles who feared his growing sympathy for Mazdakite reforms, brought Kavad first to the throne during one of the most volatile periods in Sasanian history. The new king, barely 30 years old but already experienced in provincial administration through his governorship of important eastern territories, possessed both the intellectual sophistication necessary to understand complex theological arguments and the political acumen required to navigate the dangerous factional divisions that had developed within Persian society. Kavad's physical appearance embodied the traditional martial characteristics of Sasanian royalty, while suggesting the intellectual interests that would define his approach to governance. Standing over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and muscular build of a trained warrior, he nevertheless possessed the thoughtful expression and careful speech patterns of someone who'd spent considerable time studying philosophical and theological texts. His dark eyes, described by contemporaries as capable of shifting rapidly between gentle contemplation and fierce determination, reflected the complex personality that would enable him to pursue radical reforms while maintaining the respect of military commanders and administrative officials. The new king's initial encounters with Mazdakite teachings occurred through his personal friendship with nobles who had become converts to the movement during the previous reign. These relationships provided Kavad with detailed knowledge of Mazdakite theology and social programs, while enabling him to assess the movement's potential for addressing the empire's fundamental problems. His gradual conversion to Mazdakite principles reflected both genuine religious conviction and calculated political strategy, as he recognized the movement's potential for mobilizing popular support while undermining the authority of traditional elites who had opposed his policies. Kavad's public endorsement of Mazdakite reforms in 496 AD marked a revolutionary turning point in Sasanian history, as royal authority was deployed for the first time in support of systematic social transformation, rather than the preservation of existing hierarchical structures. The king's proclamation, issued from the throne room of the Great Palace at Ctesiphon, before an assembly that included both Mazdakite leaders and traditional nobles, announced his intention to implement comprehensive reforms designed to eliminate poverty and social inequality throughout the empire. The specific measures announced in Kavad's reform program addressed the core grievances that had fueled Mazdakite popularity, while demonstrating the king's commitment to translating religious ideals into practical administrative policies. Land redistribution initiatives targeted the vast estates accumulated by noble families, proposing the division of underutilized properties among landless farmers who would receive secure tenure rights in exchange for fixed annual payments to the royal treasury. These agricultural reforms promised to increase productivity while reducing the economic dependence that had enabled wealthy landowners to exploit rural populations, Urban reforms included measures designed to regulate commercial activities and prevent the accumulation of excessive wealth by merchant families who had profited from wartime shortages and currency fluctuations. Royal decrees established maximum prices for essential commodities while creating public distribution systems that would ensure adequate food supplies for poor urban populations. Artisan guilds received enhanced legal protections and guaranteed access to raw materials, enabling skilled craftsmen to maintain their livelihoods despite economic instability. The administrative implementation of these reforms required extensive bureaucratic coordination, as royal officials throughout the empire received detailed instructions for conducting property assessments, organising redistribution programs, and establishing new legal frameworks for protecting the rights of previously disadvantaged populations. The complexity of these operations demonstrated both the sophisticated administrative capabilities that the Sasanian government had developed over centuries of imperial rule and the enormous challenges involved in implementing systematic social transformation across such vast and diverse territories. Traditional noble families responded to these reform initiatives with organised resistance that quickly escalated into open rebellion against royal authority. The opposition coalition included not only wealthy landowners whose economic interests were directly threatened by redistribution policies, but also Zoroastrian priests who viewed Mazdakite theology as heretical deviation from orthodox doctrine, and military commanders who feared that social upheaval would undermine the disciplined hierarchical structures essential for effective army operations. The rebellion that erupted in 498 AD demonstrated both the depth of elite opposition to Kavad's reforms and the sophisticated organisational capabilities that traditional authorities retained despite their loss of popular support. Rebel forces, commanded by experienced military officers who had served in previous campaigns against nomadic enemies, possessed superior equipment and tactical training that initially enabled them to achieve significant victories against royal armies that included large numbers of recently recruited peasant soldiers whose loyalty to the reform program exceeded their military effectiveness. The capture of Ctesiphon by rebel forces in 499 AD represented the climax of noble resistance to Kavad's revolutionary policies and demonstrated the continuing importance of traditional military elites within Sasanian political structures. The king's deposition and imprisonment in the fortress of Anush-i-Ruwan marked the temporary triumph of conservative forces who immediately began reversing the social reforms that had been implemented during the previous 3 years. However, the rebels' inability to establish stable alternative leadership revealed the fundamental weaknesses that had enabled the Mazdakite movement to gain such widespread support. Jamasp, Kavad's brother who was installed as king by the successful rebels, possessed neither the military reputation nor the administrative experience necessary to address the empire's underlying problems effectively. His physical frailty and hesitant manner contrasted unfavourably with memories of Kavad's dynamic leadership, while his immediate abandonment of popular reform programs alienated the rural and urban populations who had benefited from Mazdakite policies. The new regime's dependence on noble support created constraints that prevented effective responses to continuing Hepthalite pressure along eastern frontiers or the economic difficulties that had originally generated support for social transformation. Kavad's escape from imprisonment in 501 AD, accomplished with the assistance of his wife Purandokht, who had maintained contact with loyal supporters throughout his captivity, initiated a remarkable comeback that demonstrated both his personal charisma and the continuing popular appeal of Mazdakite reforms. The deposed king's flight to Hepthalite territories, where he sought military assistance from the very nomadic enemies who had previously humiliated Persian arms, represented a desperate gamble that revealed his determination to regain power regardless of the diplomatic and military costs involved. The Hepthalite king's decision to provide Kavad with substantial military support reflected the nomadic leader's sophisticated understanding of Persian internal politics and his recognition that a restored Kavad would be more likely to maintain peaceful relations with nomadic neighbours than the noble-dominated regime that had replaced him. The alliance between the exiled Sasanian king and his former enemies created one of the most remarkable diplomatic reversals in ancient history, demonstrating the complex calculations that characterized Central Asian political relationships during this period. The army that accompanied Kavad's return to Persian territory in 502 AD included approximately 30,000 Hepthalite cavalry, whose tactical capabilities had been proven through decades of successful warfare against Sasanian forces. These nomadic warriors, mounted on the sturdy steppe ponies that had carried them across vast distances during their migrations from Central Asia, possessed superior mobility and archery skills that complemented the disciplined formations and heavy equipment of Persian military units that remained loyal to the exiled king. The campaign that restored Kavad to the throne demonstrated both the military effectiveness of the Hepthalite-Persian alliance and the fundamental weakness of Jamasp's regime among the general population. City after city opened its gates to the advancing forces as local populations welcomed the return of the king, who had championed their interests against noble exploitation. The speed of Kavad's advance across Persian territories reflected not only superior military capabilities, but also the popular support that his reform programs had generated among communities that had suffered under the restored traditional administration. The final confrontation between Kavad and Yamasp occurred near the ancient city of Ray in 503 AD, where the usurper had concentrated his remaining forces in a desperate attempt to preserve noble control over the empire. The battle demonstrated the tactical evolution that had occurred in Persian military doctrine as Hepthalite cavalry techniques were integrated with traditional Sasanian formations to create combined arms units capable of unprecedented flexibility and striking power. Kavad's personal leadership during the engagement, fighting alongside his nomadic allies while wearing the distinctive royal armour that symbolised legitimate Sasanian authority, inspired his forces to achieve complete victory over the rebel army. Yamasp's death during the battle, struck down by a Hepthalite arrow while attempting to rally his fleeing troops, ended the noble rebellion and restored Kavad to unchallenged control over the empire. However, the king's dependence on foreign military support had created new diplomatic obligations that would influence Persian policy for years to come, while the social tensions that had generated the original conflict remained largely unresolved despite his restoration to power. The restored Kavad's approach to implementing Mazdakite reforms reflected lessons learned from his previous overthrow and demonstrated greater political sophistication in managing the competing interests that characterized Persian society. Rather than immediately resuming the comprehensive social transformation that had provoked a noble rebellion, the king adopted a more gradual approach that introduced reforms incrementally while maintaining sufficient traditional structures to prevent organized resistance from developing. This tactical adjustment enabled him to achieve many of his original objectives while avoiding the political mistakes that had led to his temporary deposition. The land redistribution programs that resumed in 505 AD incorporated safeguards designed to protect legitimate noble interests while addressing the grievances of landless peasants who had supported the Mazdakite movement. Royal commissioners conducted detailed surveys of agricultural properties throughout the empire, identifying underutilized estates that could be subdivided without destroying the economic foundations of cooperative noble families. These careful assessments enabled the government to redistribute substantial amounts of land while maintaining the support of moderate elements within the traditional elite. Urban reform initiatives demonstrated similar tactical sophistication as royal administrators worked with existing merchant and artisan organizations to implement changes that addressed popular grievances without completely disrupting established commercial relationships. Price regulation mechanisms incorporated input from guild representatives while creating appeal procedures that enabled legitimate businesses to seek relief from regulations that might threaten their viability. These collaborative approaches reduced resistance to reform programs, while ensuring that policy implementation reflected practical understanding of local economic conditions. The evolution of Mazdakite religious practices under royal patronage created new forms of spiritual expression that combined orthodox Zoroastrian traditions with the egalitarian ideals that had originally attracted popular support to the movement. Royal fire temples incorporated communal meal programs that demonstrated the practical implementation of social equality principles while maintaining the ceremonial dignity that Persian populations expected from official religious observances. These synthetic religious practices helped bridge the gap between traditional and revolutionary elements within Persian society. However, the gradual moderation of Mazdakite reforms that enabled Kavad to maintain political stability also created tensions within the movement itself, as radical followers who had expected immediate and complete social transformation became increasingly critical of what they viewed as royal compromise with oppressive traditional structures. The emergence of extremist factions within the Mazdakite movement, advocating more aggressive approaches to property redistribution and social reorganization, created new challenges for royal authority, while providing opportunities for opponents of reform to exploit internal divisions within the king's support base. The most serious manifestation of radical Mazdakite activity occurred in the eastern provinces, where local leaders interpreted royal reform policies as authorization for the complete elimination of private property and traditional family structures. These extreme interpretations of Mazdakite doctrine resulted in violent confrontations between different social groups, while creating administrative chaos that threatened the stability of territories that remained vulnerable to Hephthalite invasion. The royal government's need to suppress these radical activities while maintaining its commitment to moderate reform created complex political challenges that required careful navigation. Kavad's response to extremist Mazdakite activities demonstrated his pragmatic approach to implementing social reforms while preserving imperial stability and territorial integrity. Royal forces dispatched to restore order in affected provinces included both traditional Persian military units and Hephthalite cavalry, whose presence served as a reminder of the king's continuing alliance with nomadic powers. The systematic suppression of radical activities, conducted with sufficient force to restore administrative control, while avoiding excessive brutality that might alienate moderate supporters, revealed the sophisticated political calculations that characterized Kavad's mature approach to governance. The gradual suppression of the Mazdakite movement that began around 524 AD reflected both the king's recognition that continuing social upheaval threatened imperial stability and his awareness that his son and designated successor, Khosrow, possessed fundamentally different views about the proper relationship between royal authority and social reform. The execution of Mazdak himself, conducted in the royal presence at Ctesiphon around 528 AD, symbolized the definitive end of the revolutionary phase of Sasanian social policy, while demonstrating Kavad's determination to ensure a smooth succession transition. The method of Mazdak's execution, involving burial alive with only his head exposed above ground, reflected both the severity of the charges against him and the king's desire to avoid creating a martyr whose death might inspire renewed radical activity. The gruesome spectacle, witnessed by assembled nobles and officials who had opposed the Mazdakite movement throughout its existence, served as a definitive statement that the era of revolutionary social experimentation had ended and that traditional hierarchical structures would be restored under the coming reign. The final years of Kavad's reign were dominated by preparations for the succession of his son Khosrow, whose education had been carefully managed to ensure his competence in military affairs and administrative governance while avoiding the theological interest that had led his father toward radical social policies. The Crown Prince's training included extensive exposure to traditional Zoroastrian doctrine under the guidance of Orthodox priests who had been selected specifically for their opposition to Mazdakite innovations, creating a religious foundation that would support the conservative policies that would characterize the next reign. The coronation of Khosrow in 531 AD marked the ascension of a monarch whose reign would fundamentally transform the Sasanian Empire from a realm recovering from social upheaval into the most sophisticated and powerful state of the ancient world. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with the characteristic aquiline nose of the Sasanian dynasty, the new king possessed an intellectual bearing that distinguished him from his more martially focused predecessors. His dark eyes, described by contemporary observers as reflecting both penetrating intelligence and calculating ambition, suggested the analytical mind that would revolutionize Persian administration, military organization, and cultural development over the next 5 decades. The empire that Khosrow inherited bore the scars of his father's revolutionary experiments and their subsequent suppression. Provincial administration had been disrupted by decades of social upheaval. Military effectiveness had been compromised by factional divisions within the officer corps, and the royal treasury remained strained by the costs of maintaining hepthalite alliances and suppressing internal rebellions. The new king's immediate challenge involved restoring governmental efficiency and military capability, while avoiding the social tensions that had characterized Kavad's reign. Khosrow's approach to these challenges reflected the comprehensive education he'd received from the empire's most distinguished scholars, administrators, and military commanders. His tutors had included veterans of Bahram V's Central Asian campaigns, experienced provincial governors who understood the complexities of managing diverse populations, and Zoroastrian theologians who provided orthodox religious training designed to counteract any lingering Mazdakite influences. This educational foundation enabled him to understand both the theoretical principles of effective governance and the practical realities of implementing complex policies across vast territories. The administrative reforms that would earn Khosrow the epithet Anushirvan began with a systematic reorganization of the imperial bureaucracy designed to eliminate the inefficiencies and corruption that had developed during previous decades of political instability. The king established new administrative departments with clearly defined responsibilities and reporting structures, creating a governmental apparatus capable of coordinating complex operations across the empire's diverse provinces. Each department received detailed written procedures that standardized administrative practices while establishing accountability mechanisms that enabled royal oversight of bureaucratic performance. The most significant innovation in Khosrow's administrative system involved the creation of a professional civil service, recruited through competitive examinations that tested candidates' knowledge of law, mathematics, geography, and administrative procedures. This meritocratic approach to governmental appointments represented a dramatic departure from traditional practices that had relied primarily on hereditary privilege and personal connections to the royal court. The new system attracted talented individuals from across the social spectrum, while reducing the influence of noble families who had previously dominated administrative positions. The examination system that Khosrow established required candidates to demonstrate proficiency in multiple languages, including Middle Persian, Aramaic, and Greek, reflecting the multicultural nature of the empire and the international scope of its diplomatic and commercial relationships. Mathematical competency tests included problems related to taxation calculations, military logistics, and engineering projects, ensuring that successful candidates possess the quantitative skills necessary for effective administrative performance. Legal examinations covered both traditional Zoroastrian law and the practical jurisprudence that had developed through centuries of imperial governance. Provincial administration underwent equally comprehensive transformation, as Khosrow replaced the traditional satrap system with a more centralized structure that provided greater royal control over regional governance while maintaining sufficient local autonomy to address specific territorial needs. The empire was divided into 4 major administrative regions: each governed by a sparebed who possessed both civil and military authority within his jurisdiction. These regional commanders reported directly to the king through a sophisticated communication network that enabled rapid transmission of orders and intelligence across vast distances. The sparbed system created clear chains of command that eliminated the jurisdictional conflicts and administrative delays that had plagued previous governmental structures. Each regional commander supervised multiple provincial governors who were responsible for taxation, judicial administration, and public works projects within their territories. These governors received standardized instructions that ensured consistent policy implementation while providing flexibility for addressing local conditions and requirements. Taxation reform represented perhaps the most crucial element of Khosrow's administrative revolution, as the new system needed to generate sufficient revenue for ambitious military and construction projects while avoiding the oppressive burden that had contributed to social unrest during his father's reign. The king commissioned comprehensive surveys of agricultural productivity throughout the empire, creating detailed records of land quality, irrigation capabilities, and crop yields that enabled more accurate and equitable tax assessments. These surveys required several years to complete and involved thousands of trained assessors who measured fields, evaluated soil conditions, and calculated potential revenues based on historical production data. The new taxation system replaced arbitrary levies with fixed assessments based on objective criteria, including land area, soil fertility, and access to water resources. Farmers received written documentation of their tax obligations, eliminating the uncertainty and potential for abuse that had characterized previous collection methods. Payment schedules were adjusted to accommodate seasonal agricultural cycles, reducing the financial pressure on rural populations while ensuring steady revenue flows to the royal treasury throughout the year. Urban taxation underwent similar rationalization as royal administrators established standardized rates for different types of commercial and artisan activities. Merchant guilds received official recognition and legal protections in exchange for their cooperation in tax collection and commercial regulation. These arrangements created stable business environments that encouraged economic growth while providing the government with reliable sources of revenue from expanding trade networks. Military reform complemented administrative reorganization in creating the governmental apparatus necessary for Khosrow's ambitious foreign policy objectives. The king recognized that traditional Persian military advantages in heavy cavalry and siege warfare needed to be supplemented with improved organizational structures and tactical innovations that could address the diverse challenges posed by Roman legions, nomadic raiders, and various regional opponents throughout the empire's extensive frontiers. The reformed Sasanian army incorporated lessons learned from decades of conflict with different types of enemies, while maintaining the distinctive characteristics that had made Persian forces formidable throughout their history. Heavy cavalry units retained their traditional cataphract equipment of scale armour and long lances, but received enhanced training in coordinated manoeuvres that enabled more flexible tactical responses to changing battlefield conditions. These elite formations served as the army's striking force while providing the psychological impact that Persian commanders had traditionally relied upon to demoralize enemy troops. Infantry development represented a significant innovation in Sasanian military doctrine, as Khosrow recognized the need for foot soldiers capable of operating effectively in the varied terrain conditions encountered throughout the empire's territories. The new infantry formations included specialized units trained for mountain warfare, siege operations, and urban combat, creating military capabilities that complemented traditional cavalry strengths, while addressing tactical situations where mounted troops proved less effective. Archery units received particular attention as Khosrow's military advisors recognized the continuing importance of missile weapons in Persian tactical doctrine. The famous Persian composite bows underwent technical improvements that increased their range and penetrating power, while maintaining the reliability that had made them legendary throughout the ancient world. Training programs emphasized accuracy and rapid shooting techniques that enabled Persian archers to maintain suppressive fire during extended engagements while conserving ammunition for critical moments. Engineering corps became integral components of the reformed military structure, as Khosrau's strategic vision required capabilities for constructing field fortifications, conducting complex siege operations, and maintaining supply lines across difficult terrain. Military engineers received training in mathematics, mechanics, and construction techniques that enabled them to design and build sophisticated equipment, including catapults, battering rams, and mobile towers. These technical specialists also supervised the construction of permanent fortifications along threatened frontiers, creating defensive networks that could channel enemy attacks into predetermined killing zones. The intellectual revolution that accompanied Khosrau's administrative and military reforms manifested itself most dramatically in the systematic translation of Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Middle Persian. This unprecedented scholarly undertaking reflected the king's recognition that effective governance required access to the accumulated wisdom of different civilizations, while also demonstrating his commitment to establishing the Sasanian Empire as the intellectual centre of the ancient world. The translation movement began with the arrival of Neoplatonic philosophers fleeing the closure of the Academy of Athens by Emperor Justinian in 529 AD. These scholars, including figures like Damasius and Simplicius, brought with them extensive libraries of Greek texts covering philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and other fields of knowledge that had been developed over centuries of Hellenic intellectual achievement. Khosrau's decision to welcome these refugees and support their scholarly activities created opportunities for unprecedented cultural exchange between Greek and Persian intellectual traditions. The Royal Library at Ctesiphon became the centre of this translation enterprise as teams of bilingual scholars worked systematically through Greek manuscripts while creating Middle Persian versions that would be accessible to Persian readers. The translation process involved more than simple linguistic conversion, as scholars needed to adapt Greek philosophical concepts and scientific terminology to Persian intellectual frameworks while preserving the essential meaning of the original texts. This complex undertaking required extensive collaboration between Greek refugee scholars, Persian intellectuals, and linguistic specialists who possessed the technical expertise necessary for accurate translation work. Philosophical texts received particular attention as Khosrau recognized their potential value for developing more sophisticated approaches to governmental administration and legal jurisprudence. Works by Plato and Aristotle provided theoretical frameworks for understanding political organization and ethical behavior that complemented traditional Zoroastrian teachings, while offering new perspectives on the challenges of imperial governance. Neoplatonic texts contributed metaphysical concepts that influenced Persian theological development and provided intellectual foundations for the religious tolerance that would characterize Khosrau's domestic policies. Scientific translations encompassed mathematical treatises that advanced Persian understanding of geometry, astronomy, and engineering principles essential for military and construction projects. Medical texts introduced diagnostic techniques and therapeutic approaches that improved healthcare throughout the empire, while contributing to the development of Persian medical schools that would influence Islamic scholarship centuries later. Agricultural manuals provided information about crop rotation, irrigation methods, and livestock breeding that enhanced productivity in Persian farming regions. The Eternal Peace Treaty, negotiated with Emperor Justinian V in 532 AD, represented the diplomatic culmination of Khosrau's early reign and demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of international relations. The agreement addressed long-standing territorial disputes while establishing commercial and diplomatic frameworks that would enable both empires to focus their resources on other strategic priorities. The treaty negotiations revealed Khosrow's diplomatic skill and his recognition that military conflict with Rome, while potentially profitable in the short term, would ultimately drain resources needed for internal development and eastern frontier defence. The treaty's territorial provisions established clear boundaries between Roman and Persian spheres of influence, while creating mechanisms for resolving future disputes through diplomatic rather than military means. Armenia, the traditional flashpoint for Roman-Persian conflicts, received a special status that acknowledged both empires' interests while providing local autonomy that reduced incentives for rebellion. The agreement also addressed commercial relationships, establishing standardized customs procedures and legal protections for merchants operating across imperial boundaries. Justinian's agreement to pay substantial subsidies for Persian maintenance of Caucasian fortifications provided Khosrow with additional revenue while acknowledging the mutual benefits both empires derived from preventing nomadic incursions through the strategic mountain passes. These financial arrangements enabled the Persian king to strengthen frontier defences while reducing the fiscal burden on his own treasury, creating resources that could be devoted to internal development projects and military modernisation. However, the peaceful relationship established by the Eternal Peace would prove temporary, as both rulers' ambitions eventually exceeded the constraints imposed by diplomatic agreements. Justinian's successful campaigns against the Vandals in North Africa and his initial victories against the Ostrogoths in Italy demonstrated Roman military capabilities that threatened to upset the balance of power established by the treaty. The emperor's growing confidence in his forces' abilities, combined with his theological commitment to reuniting the former territories of the Roman Empire, created pressures for renewed expansion that would inevitably conflict with Persian interests. The breakdown of the Eternal Peace began with Justinian's intervention in the affairs of Lazica, a strategically important kingdom in the Caucasus region that controlled access routes between the Black Sea and Persian territories. The emperor's decision to establish Roman influence in this area violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the peace treaty, while threatening Persian security interests that Khosrow could not ignore, without appearing weak to his own nobles and regional allies. The Lazic War that erupted in 541 AD demonstrated both the military effectiveness of Khosrow's reforms and the continuing challenges involved in conducting sustained operations in a mountainous terrain far from Persian supply bases. The conflict's initial phases favoured Persian forces whose superior organisation and equipment enabled them to achieve tactical victories against Roman units that had been weakened by simultaneous commitments to campaigns in Italy and North Africa. However, the strategic advantages that geography provided to defenders operating in familiar territory gradually offset Persian tactical superiority. The Siege of Petra, the principal Roman fortress in Lazica, showcased the engineering capabilities that Khosrow's military reforms had developed while demonstrating the persistence and tactical skill that characterized his approach to warfare. Persian siege operations incorporated advanced techniques, including the construction of elaborate earthworks that protected assault troops while providing platforms for artillery bombardment. The systematic approach to reducing enemy fortifications reflected the mathematical precision and engineering expertise that had become hallmarks of Persian military doctrine under Khosrow's leadership. Roman resistance at Petra revealed the continuing effectiveness of traditional defensive tactics when supported by adequate supplies and competent leadership. The fortress garrison, commanded by experienced officers who understood the strategic importance of maintaining their position, conducted a defence that maximised the advantages provided by their fortifications, while inflicting substantial casualties on Persian assault forces. The prolonged nature of the siege tested Persian logistical capabilities while providing Roman commanders with time to organise relief expeditions. The eventual capture of Petra after an 18-month siege demonstrated Persian tactical superiority, while revealing the enormous costs associated with conducting complex military operations in remote territories. The victory provided Khosrau with strategic control over key Caucasian routes, while eliminating a major Roman stronghold that had threatened Persian interests in the region. However, the resources consumed during the siege operations limited Persian capabilities for pursuing additional objectives, while the extended timeline enabled Roman forces to strengthen their positions elsewhere in the theatre. Simultaneously with these Western campaigns, Khosrau was developing the strategic partnerships that would enable him to address the continuing nomadic threats along his eastern frontiers. The emergence of the Gokturk Confederation as a major power in Central Asia created opportunities for diplomatic cooperation against their mutual Hepthalite enemies, whose control over Silk Road trade routes continued to limit both Persian and Turkish territorial ambitions in the region. The alliance negotiations with Istemi Khan, the Western Gokturk ruler, demonstrated Khosrau's sophisticated understanding of nomadic political structures and his ability to adapt Persian diplomatic practices to accommodate the different cultural expectations of steppe societies. The agreements reached through these negotiations established coordinated military strategies that would enable both allies to attack Hepthalite territories simultaneously while dividing the anticipated territorial and commercial gains according to predetermined arrangements. The military preparations for the joint campaign against the Hepthalites required extensive coordination between Persian and Turkish forces, whose tactical doctrines and organisational structures differed significantly despite their shared nomadic heritage. Persian advisors worked with Gokturk commanders to develop combined operational plans that would maximise each ally's strengths while minimising the potential for misunderstandings or conflicts during joint operations. These collaborative planning sessions created personal relationships between military leaders that would facilitate cooperation during the challenging campaign ahead. The death of Khosrau in 579 AD brought to the throne his son Hormizd IV, whose reign would initiate the most catastrophic period in Sasanian history. The new king inherited an empire at the zenith of its territorial extent and administrative sophistication, yet within 50 years these achievements would lie in ruins, the dynasty's survival hanging by the slenderest of threads. Hormizd IV possessed his father's intellectual curiosity and administrative competence, but lacked the diplomatic finesse and military acumen that had enabled Khosrau I to maintain the delicate balance between internal development and external expansion. Standing slightly shorter than his imposing father, Hormizd IV compensated for his less commanding physical presence through an almost obsessive attention to governmental detail that impressed courtiers while alienating military commanders who valued decisive leadership over bureaucratic precision. His thin frame and prematurely greying hair suggested the nervous energy that characterized his approach to governance, as he attempted to micromanage administrative operations that previous kings had delegated to trusted subordinates. This controlling tendency would prove particularly problematic in military affairs, where his interference with field commanders' tactical decisions created dangerous delays and missed opportunities during critical campaigns. The domestic policies that defined Hormizd IV's early reign reflected his commitment to continuing his father's administrative reforms while addressing social tensions that had persisted despite decades of governmental rationalization. His approach to religious minorities demonstrated a pragmatic tolerance that maintained Zoroastrian supremacy while avoiding the persecution that had characterized earlier periods of Sasanian rule. Christian communities received legal protections that enabled them to practice their faith openly while contributing their commercial and administrative skills to imperial prosperity. However, this religious tolerance created friction with Orthodox Zoroastrian priests, who viewed any accommodation with non-believers as a dangerous compromise with the forces of darkness. The fire temples that had served as centres of royal ideology since Ardashir's time became focal points for conservative opposition to policies that seemed to undermine traditional religious authority. Qartir's successors, while lacking his political influence, retained sufficient institutional power to create administrative obstacles for royal initiatives that conflicted with orthodox doctrine. The military challenges that would ultimately destroy Hormizd IV's reign began developing along the empire's northeastern frontiers, where Göktürk expansion had created new strategic pressures following the successful destruction of Hephthalite power. The Turkish Confederation's rapid territorial acquisitions brought nomadic forces to within striking distance of major Persian cities, while disrupting the trade relationships that had provided substantial revenues for the royal treasury. The Göktürk's sophisticated military organization, combining traditional steppe mobility with siege techniques acquired through contact with Chinese armies, represented a more formidable threat than previous nomadic opponents. Bahram Chobin, the general who would ultimately overthrow Hormizd IV, first distinguished himself during the defensive campaigns against these Turkish incursions. His background differed significantly from that of traditional Persian nobles, as his family belonged to the Mihran clan, one of the 7 great Parthian houses that had maintained their influence throughout the Sasanian period, despite their non-Persian origins. This ancestry provided him with extensive connections among the military aristocracy, while creating potential tensions with the Sasanian royal family, whose legitimacy partly depended on claims of pure Persian bloodline. Physically, Bahram Chobin embodied the martial ideals that Persian society associated with effective military leadership. Standing over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders and muscular build of a professional warrior, he possessed the dark complexion and sharp features characteristic of the Eastern Iranian populations from which his family had emerged. His penetrating gaze and commanding voice enabled him to inspire confidence among his troops while intimidating opponents who faced him in combat or negotiation. Unlike the scholarly demeanour that characterised Hormizd IV, Bahram projected the physical authority that soldiers expected from their commanders. The general's military innovations reflected his practical understanding of the tactical challenges posed by nomadic opponents, whose mobility and archery skills had traditionally provided them with significant advantages over Persian forces. His reforms emphasized the development of lighter cavalry units that could match Turkish strategic mobility while maintaining sufficient striking power to achieve decisive results in open combat. These new formations required extensive retraining of existing troops and the recruitment of additional personnel familiar with the fighting techniques necessary for steppe warfare. Bahram's tactical doctrine incorporated lessons learned from decades of conflict with various nomadic opponents, while adapting traditional Persian military strengths to address the specific challenges posed by Göktürk forces. His cavalry units operated in smaller, more flexible formations that could respond quickly to changing battlefield conditions, while maintaining the coordinated maneuvers that had made Persian armies formidable throughout their history. Supporting infantry formations received enhanced training and rapid deployment techniques that enabled them to establish defensive positions quickly when threatened by nomadic cavalry charges. The successful campaigns that established Bahram Chobin's military reputation demonstrated both his tactical competence and his ability to inspire exceptional performance from troops who had grown accustomed to defensive operations along threatened frontiers. His victory over a major Göktürk invasion force near the ancient city of Balkh in 588 AD showcased the effectiveness of his military reforms, while providing the Persian Empire with a desperately needed demonstration of continued military capability. The battle near Balkh began with the traditional cavalry skirmishing that characterized conflicts between Persian and nomadic forces, but quickly evolved into a complex tactical engagement that tested both commanders' abilities to adapt their strategies to changing circumstances. The Göktürk army, numbering approximately 30,000 warriors organized according to the decimal system that had proven effective in previous nomadic conquests, deployed in loose formations designed to maximize their mobility advantages while minimizing exposure to Persian artillery fire. Bahram's tactical response involved a sophisticated maneuver that drew the Turkish forces into a carefully prepared killing zone, where concealed Persian units could attack from multiple directions simultaneously. His personal leadership during the battle's critical moments proved decisive, as the general led a concentrated cavalry charge that broke through the Turkish centre at the precise moment when their tactical cohesion began to waver under sustained pressure from coordinated Persian attacks. The victory's psychological impact throughout the Persian Empire exceeded its strategic significance, as populations that had grown accustomed to military setbacks and territorial losses celebrated the restoration of Persian martial prestige. Bahram Chobin's name became synonymous with military excellence, while his success generated expectations for additional victories that would restore the empire's territorial integrity and international standing. However, this popular acclaim also created tensions with Hormizd IV, whose own military inexperience contrasted unfavourably with his general's proven battlefield competence. The king's response to Bahram's victory revealed the insecurity and poor judgment that would ultimately lead to his downfall. Rather than celebrating his general's success and utilising it to strengthen royal prestige, Hormizd chose to minimise Bahram's achievements while emphasising his own role in planning the campaign's strategic objectives. This petty jealousy alienated the military hero, whose loyalty was essential for maintaining royal authority, while demonstrating the kind of political incompetence that encouraged ambitious subordinates to consider alternative leadership arrangements. The deteriorating relationship between king and general was exacerbated by Hormizd's decision to reduce Bahram's command authority while assigning him to less prestigious military positions that failed to utilise his proven capabilities effectively. These administrative changes appear to reflect royal fear of Bahram's growing popularity rather than rational assessment of military requirements, creating resentment among officers who recognised the general's superior competence while questioning the king's strategic judgment. The palace coup that brought Bahram Chobin to power in 590 AD occurred with startling swiftness as military units throughout the empire declared their support for the general who had restored Persian military honour. Hormizd IV's assassination during the initial stages of the rebellion eliminated the primary obstacle to Bahram's assumption of royal authority, while demonstrating the complete collapse of support for the legitimate dynasty among the empire's most important constituencies. However, Bahram's seizure of power faced immediate challenges from Khosrow II, Hormizd IV's son, whose escape from the palace coup enabled him to organise resistance to the usurper's regime. The young prince, barely 20 years old but already experienced in court politics through his involvement in his father's administration, possessed both the legitimacy of royal birth and the political acumen necessary to exploit the constitutional crisis that Bahram's rebellion had created. Khosrow II's physical appearance embodied the traditional characteristics of Sasanian royalty, while suggesting the intelligence and determination that would define his approach to reclaiming his throne. Standing nearly as tall as his father with the distinctive aquiline nose of the dynasty, he possessed the dark eyes and commanding presence that Persian society associated with legitimate royal authority. His youth provided him with energy and adaptability that contrasted favourably with Bahram's more rigid military mindset, while his education in administrative and diplomatic affairs prepared him for the complex challenges involved in restoring royal power. The civil war that erupted between Bahram Chobin and Khosrow II divided the Persian Empire along regional and factional lines, while creating opportunities for external enemies to exploit the internal chaos. Bahram's support came primarily from military units in eastern provinces that had benefited from his successful campaigns against nomadic enemies, while Khosrow attracted backing from western territories and administrative officials who valued dynastic legitimacy over military competence. Khosrow's decision to seek Byzantine assistance represented a desperate gamble that violated fundamental principles of Persian independence while offering the only realistic prospect for defeating Bahram's superior military forces. The young prince's flight to Constantinople in 591 AD created an unprecedented diplomatic opportunity for Emperor Maurice, whose own military capabilities had been strained by simultaneous conflicts along multiple frontiers. The Byzantine court that received Khosrow II was experiencing its own period of military and financial stress, as Maurice's campaigns against the Avars in the Balkans and various threats along the eastern frontier had depleted the imperial treasury while failing to achieve decisive strategic gains. The emperor's decision to support the exiled Persian prince reflected both his recognition of the strategic advantages that a grateful client king would provide and his understanding that Persian civil war created unique opportunities for Byzantine territorial expansion. Maurice's physical appearance and personality contrasted sharply with the martial bearing that characterized most successful Byzantine emperors. Of medium height, with the scholarly demeanor of someone who had spent more time studying military theory than practicing it, he possessed the intellectual sophistication necessary for complex diplomatic negotiations, while lacking the charismatic leadership that inspired exceptional performance from his troops. His methodical approach to military planning produced competent but uninspired campaigns that achieved limited objectives without generating the decisive victories that would have strengthened his domestic political position. The restoration agreement negotiated between Maurice and Khosrow II established the framework for Byzantine military intervention in Persian affairs, while defining the territorial and diplomatic concessions that the prince would provide in exchange for imperial support. The treaty's provisions included significant Persian territorial cessions in Armenia and Mesopotamia, commercial agreements that favoured Byzantine merchants, and diplomatic arrangements that would make the restored Sasanian king a virtual client of the Byzantine Empire. The military expedition that Maurice organised to restore Khosrow II represented one of the largest Byzantine forces deployed in the east since Justinian's campaigns, including approximately 40,000 troops drawn from both European and Asian provinces. The army's composition reflected the emperor's understanding of the tactical challenges involved in fighting Persian forces, with substantial cavalry contingents capable of matching Sasanian mobility and siege equipment necessary for reducing fortified positions. The campaign's initial phases achieved rapid success as Byzantine forces advanced through Armenian territories, while local populations welcomed them as liberators from Bahram Chobin's military rule. The usurper's support began eroding as regional commanders recognized the futility of resisting the combined Byzantine-Khosrow alliance, while questioning the legitimacy of a non-royal ruler who had achieved power through military rebellion rather than dynastic succession. The decisive confrontation between Bahram Chobin and the restoration forces occurred near the ancient city of Ganzak in 591 AD, where the usurper had concentrated his remaining loyal troops in a final attempt to preserve his regime. The battle demonstrated both the tactical effectiveness of the Byzantine-Persian alliance and the fundamental weakness of Bahram's position among populations that had grown weary of civil war and military rule. Bahram's defeat and subsequent flight to Turkish territories marked the end of his brief reign, while enabling Khosrow II's restoration to the Sasanian throne. However, the young king's dependence on Byzantine military support had created diplomatic obligations that would constrain Persian policy for years to come, while establishing precedents for foreign intervention in Sasanian internal affairs that would have profound consequences for the empire's future independence. The early years of Khosrow II's restored reign were dominated by the necessity of fulfilling his obligations to Maurice, while attempting to rebuild royal authority that had been severely damaged by the civil war and foreign intervention. The territorial concessions promised to the Byzantine emperor included some of the most strategically important regions along the western frontier, while the commercial agreements provided Byzantine merchants with unprecedented access to Persian markets and trade routes. However, the assassination of Maurice in 602 AD by the usurper Phocas created an entirely new diplomatic situation that would ultimately lead to the greatest war in ancient history between the Persian and Byzantine empires. Khosrow II's decision to use Maurice's death as justification for military intervention in Byzantine affairs reflected both his genuine outrage at the murder of his benefactor and his recognition that the crisis provided unprecedented opportunities for territorial expansion and the restoration of Persian prestige. The Great War that began in 603 AD would consume both empires' resources while reshaping the political geography of the Middle East in ways that neither ruler could have anticipated when the conflict commenced. Khosrow's initial military objectives focused on recovering the territories that had been ceded to Maurice, while punishing the usurper who had murdered his ally and protector. However, the remarkable success of Persian arms during the war's opening phases would encourage far more ambitious goals that would ultimately contribute to the Sasanian Empire's catastrophic collapse. The Persian offensive that began with the invasion of Byzantine Armenia in 603 AD demonstrated the military effectiveness of the reforms that had been implemented during the previous decade of internal reconstruction. Khosrow's armies included both traditional heavy cavalry formations and the lighter, more mobile units that had proven effective against nomadic opponents, creating combined arms forces capable of adapting to different tactical situations while maintaining overall strategic coherence. The systematic nature of Persian territorial conquests during the war's early phases reflected Khosrow's sophisticated understanding of strategic planning and his determination to achieve permanent gains rather than temporary military victories. Persian forces methodically reduced Byzantine strongholds while establishing administrative structures that could govern conquered territories effectively, demonstrating the organizational capabilities that had been developed through decades of imperial experience. The capture of Damascus in 613 AD provided the Persian Empire with control over one of the most important commercial and administrative centers in the Byzantine East, while demonstrating the complete collapse of imperial resistance in Syria. The city's surrender after a brief siege enabled Khosrow's forces to advance toward even more prestigious objectives while securing their communications and supply lines through territories that had been thoroughly subdued. The conquest of Jerusalem in 614 AD represented the climactic achievement of Persian arms and provided Khosrow II with prestige that exceeded even the greatest victories of his predecessors. The capture of Christianity's most sacred city sent shockwaves throughout the Byzantine Empire while demonstrating Persian military superiority in the most dramatic possible fashion. The systematic removal of Christian relics, including the True Cross, to Ctesiphon symbolized the complete reversal of fortune that had occurred since the beginning of the war. The assassination of Khosrow II in February 628 AD by his own son Kavad II marked the beginning of the most catastrophic period in Sasanian history. The great king's death in the dungeons of his own palace, strangled by conspirators who included members of his immediate family, symbolized the complete breakdown of royal authority that had sustained the empire for 4 centuries. Kavad II's physical appearance contrasted starkly with the imposing stature of his predecessors, slight of build with nervous, darting eyes that reflected the paranoia consuming the royal court. His reign lasted barely 8 months before plague claimed his life, but even this brief period witnessed the execution of numerous brothers and potential rivals in a desperate attempt to secure dynastic succession. The empire that emerged from Khosrow II's death bore little resemblance to the sophisticated administrative state that had dominated the ancient world for generations. The enormous costs of the Byzantine War had depleted the royal treasury, while the systematic conscription of agricultural labourers for military service had disrupted food production throughout the Iranian plateau. Provincial governors, deprived of regular payments from Ctesiphon, began asserting independence while local strongmen carved out autonomous territories from the collapsing imperial structure. The The carefully maintained balance between central authority and regional autonomy that had characterized effective Sasanian governance dissolved into chaos as competing power centers emerged across the empire's vast territories. Ardashir III, a child of perhaps 7 years, inherited this disintegrating realm under the regency of the general Shahbaraz, whose own ambitions soon became apparent. The regent's massive frame and scarred features testified to decades of military service, but his political inexperience proved inadequate for managing the complex factional divisions that had developed within the Persian elite. His decision to eliminate potential rivals through systematic purges only accelerated the empire's fragmentation as surviving nobles fled to their regional strongholds and began organizing armed resistance to central authority. The period between 628 and 632 AD witnessed an unprecedented succession of claimants to the Sasanian throne, each representing different factional interests and regional power bases. Shahbaraz himself seized the crown in 629 AD, only to face immediate rebellion from Purandokht, Khosrow II's daughter, whose claim to legitimacy rested on her direct descent from the dynasty's greatest rulers. The spectacle of a woman asserting royal authority in a society that had traditionally excluded females from political power demonstrated the desperation of circumstances and the complete breakdown of established constitutional principles. Purandokht's brief reign from 629 to 631 AD revealed both the administrative competence that characterized the Sasanian royal family and the impossibility of restoring effective governance amid such widespread chaos. Standing slightly above average height with the distinctive features of the dynasty, she possessed an intelligence and determination that impressed even hostile observers. Her attempts to negotiate peace with the Byzantine Empire while simultaneously addressing internal rebellions showed sophisticated understanding of strategic priorities, but the resources necessary for implementing effective policies had been exhausted by decades of warfare and misgovernment. The Queen's assassination in 631 AD eliminated the last ruler who possessed both dynastic legitimacy and administrative competence, leaving the throne to her sister Azarmidokht, whose even briefer reign ended with her own violent death within months. The systematic elimination of capable royal family members created a succession crisis that would ultimately bring Yazdgerd III to power as the final Sasanian king, though his youth and inexperience made him little more than a figurehead manipulated by competing noble factions. Yazdgerd III's accession in 632 AD occurred when he was approximately 8 years old, making him entirely dependent on regents whose primary concern involved advancing their own interests rather than restoring imperial unity. The young king's physical appearance suggested the nervous exhaustion that characterized the royal family during this period, pale and thin, with prematurely aged features that reflected the stress of living amid constant political violence. His education, disrupted by the chaos surrounding his accession, left him poorly prepared for the enormous challenges that would define his reign. The Regency Council that governed in Yazdgerd's name represented an uneasy coalition of surviving noble families, military commanders, and Zoroastrian priests who shared little beyond their opposition to various rival claimants. Their inability to coordinate effective policies created administrative paralysis as different regions of the empire pursued contradictory objectives, while the central government proved incapable of enforcing royal authority. Tax collection collapsed in many provinces, military units went without pay for extended periods, and essential public works projects were abandoned due to lack of funding. Meanwhile, along the empire's southwestern frontiers, a new power was emerging that would ultimately prove more dangerous than any previous enemy the Sasanians had faced. The Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, united under the religious and political leadership of Muhammad and his successors, had begun expanding beyond their traditional territories with a combination of military effectiveness and ideological fervour that caught established powers completely unprepared. The Rashidun Caliphate that emerged from these conquests possessed both the organisational capabilities necessary for for sustained military campaigns and the religious motivation that enabled extraordinary sacrifices in pursuit of territorial expansion. The initial Arab raids into Sasanian territory during the mid-630 SS were dismissed by Persian authorities as minor tribal incursions similar to the periodic Bedouin attacks that had occurred throughout history. The raiders' apparent lack of siege equipment and their preference for rapid movement over sustained operations seemed to confirm traditional assumptions about Arab military limitations. However, these early expeditions served primarily as reconnaissance missions that provided Arab commanders with detailed intelligence about Persian defensive capabilities and regional political conditions. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Arab general who would earn the epithet Saif Allah al-Maslul, possessed military talents that rivaled those of the greatest commanders in ancient history. His physical appearance reflected the harsh environment that had shaped Arab warrior culture, lean and weathered, with the penetrating gaze of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions in desperate circumstances. His tactical innovations combined traditional Bedouin mobility with disciplined formations learned through conflict with Byzantine and Persian forces, creating military capabilities that neither empire had encountered previously. The Arab military system that Khalid and other commanders developed during their expansion into Persian territories incorporated lessons learned from decades of tribal warfare while adapting to the requirements of conquering and governing settled populations. Their cavalry forces rode the hardy Arabian horses that could survive on minimal forage, while maintaining the speed and endurance necessary for extended campaigns across vast distances. Infantry formations included both traditional tribal warriors and recent converts whose religious enthusiasm compensated for their limited military experience. The decisive confrontation that would determine the fate of the western Sasanian territories occurred at Al-Qadisiyah in 636 AD, where a massive Persian army under the command of Rostam Farrokhzad faced the Arab forces of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas. The battle's significance extended far beyond its immediate tactical consequences, as it represented the collision between two fundamentally different military and social systems that had developed along separate trajectories for centuries. Rostam Farrokhzad embodied the traditional Persian military aristocracy that had dominated Middle Eastern warfare since Achaemenid times. Standing over 6 feet tall with the bearing of a professional soldier, he possessed extensive experience in campaigns against both Byzantine and nomadic opponents. His army included the finest heavy cavalry that the Sasanian Empire could still field, with cataphracts whose scale armour and long lances had proven effective in countless previous engagements. Supporting infantry formations maintained the disciplined ranks that had characterised Persian military doctrine for generations, while specialised units included engineers capable of constructing field fortifications and operating siege equipment. The Persian deployment at Al-Qadisiyah reflected traditional tactical doctrines that emphasised the coordinated use of different military arms to achieve decisive battlefield superiority. Heavy cavalry occupied the centre of the formation, positioned to deliver the shock charges that had broken enemy resistance in previous conflicts. Infantry units protected the cavalry's flanks while providing a stable base for tactical manoeuvres, and war elephants imported from India were positioned to create psychological impact on opponents who had never encountered such exotic weapons. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas commanded Arab forces that numbered approximately 30,000 warriors, organised according to tribal affiliations, while maintaining overall strategic coherence through shared religious commitment and experienced military leadership. The Arab deployment emphasised flexibility and mobility over the rigid formations favoured by their Persian opponents, with cavalry units positioned to exploit breakthrough opportunities while infantry formations remained ready to provide support where needed most urgently. The battle began with traditional skirmishing as both sides tested their opponent's strength and tactical dispositions. Arab horse archers, employing the hit-and-run tactics that had proven effective in tribal warfare, launched repeated attacks against Persian positions, while avoiding decisive engagement that might favour their enemies' superior armour and equipment. The Persians responded with coordinated cavalry charges designed to break up Arab formations before they could achieve tactical coordination, creating a swirling melee across the dusty plain. The war elephants that Rostam had positioned as his tactical reserve proved initially effective in disrupting Arab attacks, as the massive animals created panic among Arabian horses that had never encountered such creatures. However, Arab adaptability soon neutralized this advantage as warriors learned to target the elephants' mayhouts and handlers, causing the frightened animals to rampage through Persian formations with devastating effect on their own forces. The battle's turning point came when sustained Arab pressure finally broke through the Persian left flank, enabling mobile Arab units to attack the main Persian formation from multiple directions simultaneously. Rostam's death during this critical phase, struck down by an Arab spear while attempting to rally his retreating cavalry, eliminated the unified command structure that had held Persian resistance together. The collapse of organised Persian opposition occurred with startling rapidity as individual units abandoned their positions rather than face encirclement and destruction. The victory at Al-Qadisiyah provided Arab forces with access to the rich agricultural regions of Mesopotamia, while demonstrating the vulnerability of Persian military doctrine to opponents who possessed superior strategic mobility and tactical flexibility. The enormous quantities of equipment and treasure captured during the battle funded continued Arab expansion, while the psychological impact of defeating the supposedly invincible Persian army encouraged additional tribes to join the expanding Islamic Confederation. The fall of Ctesiphon in 637 AD represented the symbolic end of Sasanian power in Mesopotamia and provided the Arabs with access to the accumulated wealth of 4 centuries of imperial rule. The ancient capital's massive palaces and administrative buildings had housed the governmental apparatus that controlled territories stretching from the Euphrates to the Oxus River, while its treasuries contained gold and silver that had been collected from across the known world through taxation and tribute payments. Yazdgerd III's flight eastward from Ctesiphon marked the beginning of his desperate attempt to rally resistance from the Iranian heartland, while seeking support from regional governors who retained some measure of independent military capability. The young king's journey across the Persian plateau revealed the extent to which imperial authority had collapsed, as city after city either opened its gates to Arab forces or declared neutrality rather than risk destruction through futile resistance. The royal entourage that accompanied Yazdgerd's retreat included the remnants of the court bureaucracy, Zoroastrian priests who maintained the fire temples essential for royal legitimacy, and military units that remained loyal to the dynasty despite the empire's obvious collapse. This mobile court attempted to maintain the ceremonial dignity associated with Sasanian kingship, while constantly moving to avoid capture by pursuing Arab armies whose superior mobility made sustained resistance increasingly difficult. The king's attempts to organise effective resistance from his temporary capitals in Isfahan, Kerman, and other Persian cities demonstrated both his determination to preserve the dynasty and the practical impossibility of restoring centralised authority over territories that had been thoroughly penetrated by Arab forces. Local governors who might have provided military support were primarily concerned with protecting their own territories, while the financial resources necessary for maintaining large armies had been exhausted by decades of warfare and administrative chaos. The final phase of Yazdgerd III's reign played out in the remote eastern provinces where Sasanian authority had traditionally been weakest and where local rulers possessed the greatest independence from central control. His arrival in Merv around 651 AD represented the last desperate attempt to establish a secure base for continued resistance, while seeking support from Central Asian allies who might be willing to oppose Arab expansion into their traditional spheres of influence. The assassination of Yazdgerd III near Merv in 651 AD murdered by a local miller for the bounty that Arab authorities had placed on his head, marked the definitive end of the Sasanian dynasty and the completion of the Arab conquest of Iran. The last great king's ignoble death in a humble mill, far from the magnificent palaces where his ancestors had ruled one of the world's greatest empires, symbolized the complete transformation that had occurred in Middle Eastern political arrangements within the span of 2 decades. The collapse of the Sasanian Empire represented more than simple military defeat, as it marked the end of a political and cultural system that had dominated the ancient world for over 4 centuries. The sophisticated administrative apparatus that had governed vast territories with remarkable efficiency disappeared almost overnight, while the Zoroastrian religious establishment that had provided ideological unity for the empire faced systematic displacement by Islamic institutions that served similar functions for the new Arab rulers. The death of Yazdgerd III in 651 AD marked not merely the end of a dynasty, but the conclusion of over a millennium of Persian imperial tradition stretching back to Cyrus the Great. Yet the collapse of Sasanian political authority did not erase the profound impact this empire had exerted on the civilizations that succeeded it. The administrative systems, legal codes, and governmental practices developed over 4 centuries of Sasanian rule would prove remarkably resilient, surviving political conquest to influence the Islamic world in ways that contemporary observers could scarcely have imagined. The Umayyad caliphs who inherited Sasanian territories faced the immediate challenge of governing populations whose administrative traditions differed fundamentally from the tribal structures that had characterized Arabian society. The sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus that the Sasanians had developed, with its emphasis on written records, standardized procedures, and hierarchical chains of command, provided the new rulers with ready-made governmental tools that could be adapted to Islamic requirements without wholesale reconstruction. The divan system that emerged under early Islamic rule bore unmistakable resemblance to Sasanian administrative practices, including the departmental organization that Khosrow thus had perfected and the record-keeping procedures that had enabled effective governance across vast territories. Persian administrative personnel, many of whom had served under the final Sasanian kings, found themselves indispensable to Arab rulers who lacked experience in managing complex governmental operations. These bureaucrats, known collectively as the Kutab, maintained their positions by converting to Islam while preserving the technical expertise that had made Sasanian administration legendary throughout the ancient world. Their influence extended far beyond simple clerical functions, as they introduced Islamic governments to sophisticated concepts of taxation, provincial organization, and legal procedure that had been refined through centuries of imperial experience. The fiscal systems that the Abbasid Caliphate would later adopt demonstrated particularly clear Sasanian influence, incorporating the land survey techniques that Khosrow I had pioneered, and the assessment methods that had enabled Persian rulers to extract maximum revenue while maintaining agricultural productivity. The famous land tax registers compiled under Harun al-Rashid utilised procedures that could be traced directly to Sasanian precedents, while the administrative terminology employed in these documents frequently preserved Middle Persian technical terms that had no adequate Arabic equivalents. Legal traditions proved equally persistent, as Islamic jurisprudence absorbed Sasanian concepts of property rights, commercial regulation, and criminal procedure that had been developed through centuries of practical application. The Sasanian legal code, with its emphasis on written documentation and procedural consistency, provided Islamic scholars with sophisticated precedents for addressing complex legal questions that arose as the caliphate expanded beyond its Arabian origins. The influence of Persian legal thinking became particularly evident in commercial law, where Sasanian practices regarding contracts, partnerships, and dispute resolution were adapted to conform with Islamic principles while retaining their essential procedural characteristics. The governmental practices that characterized mature Islamic civilization reflected Sasanian influence in numerous subtle but significant ways. The elaborate court ceremonies that distinguished Abbasid rule from the simpler customs of earlier caliphs drew heavily on Persian traditions of royal dignity and hierarchical display. The protocol arrangements that governed access to the caliph, the ceremonial roles assigned to different court officials, and the symbolic elements that reinforced royal authority all demonstrated clear continuity with Sasanian precedents that had been developed to project imperial majesty across diverse populations. Provincial administration under Islamic rule incorporated Sasanian innovations, including the sparbid system that Khosrow I had created to balance central authority with regional autonomy. The Islamic institution of the wali, or provincial governor, functioned according to principles that closely resembled those that had guided Sasanian regional administration, including the combination of civil and military authority that had proven effective in managing frontier territories. The communication networks that enabled Islamic rulers to coordinate policy across vast distances utilized routes and procedures that had been established during the Sasanian period, while the intelligence systems that informed governmental decision-making preserved many of the organizational features that had characterized Persian administrative practice. The influence of Sasanian art and architecture on Islamic civilization proved equally profound, though often less immediately recognizable due to the transformations necessitated by Islamic religious requirements. The architectural principles that had guided Sasanian palace construction, including the use of massive barrel vaults and elaborate decorative programs, were adapted to create the distinctive features that characterized early Islamic monumental architecture. The Great Mosque of Damascus, constructed under Umayyad patronage, incorporated spatial concepts and construction techniques that derived directly from Sasanian precedents, while the palace complexes built by early Islamic rulers demonstrated clear influence from Persian models in their organization and decorative schemes. The artistic traditions that had flourished under Sasanian patronage provided Islamic craftsmen with sophisticated techniques for working in various media, including the metalworking skills that produced the famous Persian steel and the textile production methods that created the silk fabrics prized throughout the medieval world. The decorative motifs that had characterized Sasanian art, including the elaborate hunting scenes and royal imagery that adorned palace walls and luxury objects, were transformed to comply with Islamic aesthetic principles while preserving their essential compositional and technical characteristics. Courtly culture under Islamic rule demonstrated perhaps the most obvious Sasanian influence, as the elaborate ceremonial traditions and literary conventions that had developed during the empire's golden age were adapted to serve the needs of Islamic rulers who sought to project imperial dignity comparable to their Persian predecessors. The concept of royal gardens as earthly representations of paradise, which had reached its fullest expression under Sasanian patronage, was embraced by Islamic rulers who created elaborate garden complexes that combined Persian design principles with Islamic symbolic content. The literary traditions that emerged under early Islamic patronage drew heavily on Persian narrative conventions and thematic materials that had been preserved through the transition from Sasanian to Islamic rule. The court poets who served Abbasid caliphs frequently employed Persian literary forms and cultural references that demonstrated the continuing influence of pre-Islamic traditions on Islamic high culture. The elaborate praise poetry that characterized Abbasid court literature utilized conventions that had been developed under Sasanian patronage, while the epic narratives that celebrated Islamic conquests often incorporated structural elements derived from Persian literary traditions. Musical traditions demonstrated similar continuity, as the sophisticated court music that had characterized Sasanian culture was adapted to Islamic requirements while preserving its essential technical and aesthetic characteristics. The musical instruments that became standard in Islamic court orchestras, including various types of lutes and percussion instruments, were derived from Persian models, while the modal systems that organized Islamic musical composition demonstrated clear influence from Sasanian precedents. The survival of Zoroastrianism itself, despite the political collapse of its imperial patron, testified to the deep cultural roots that Persian religious traditions had established throughout the Iranian plateau and adjacent regions. The fire temples that had served as centres of Sasanian religious and administrative life continued to function under Islamic rule, though with reduced political influence and financial support. The Zoroastrian priesthood adapted to changed circumstances by emphasizing the religion's theological and ethical content, while maintaining the ritual practices that had sustained Persian cultural identity for over a millennium. The Parsi communities that migrated to Western India during the early Islamic period preserved Zoroastrian religious traditions with remarkable fidelity, while adapting to new social and economic environments that differed dramatically from their Persian homeland. These communities maintained the fire temples, ritual practices, and theological learning that had characterized Zoroastrianism during its imperial phase, creating cultural enclaves that preserved Persian traditions long after their political context had disappeared. The Parsi emphasis on education, commercial enterprise, and charitable activity reflected values that had been cultivated during the Sasanian period, while their distinctive religious practices maintained connections to the ancient Iranian spiritual traditions that had shaped Persian civilization. The persistence of Persian cultural identity within the Islamic world demonstrated the profound impact that Sasanian civilization had exerted on the populations that had experienced its rule. The Persian language, though written in Arabic script under Islamic rule, preserved much of its vocabulary, grammatical structure, and literary tradition from the pre-Islamic period. The cultural concepts that had been developed during the Sasanian era, including ideas about kingship, social organization, and artistic expression, continued to influence Persian-speaking populations long after the political structures that had originally fostered them had disappeared. The historiographical tradition that emerged under Islamic patronage preserved extensive knowledge of Sasanian history and culture, though often filtered through Islamic interpretative frameworks that emphasized the religious and moral lessons that could be derived from Persian imperial experience. The historical works compiled by scholars like Tabari incorporated substantial material from Sasanian sources, including detailed accounts of royal genealogies, military campaigns, and administrative practices that would otherwise have been lost. These historical compilations preserved not only factual information about Sasanian civilization, but also the cultural values and interpretative approaches that had characterized Persian historical thinking. The role of Sasanian Persia in shaping medieval Islamic historical consciousness extended far beyond simple factual preservation to encompass fundamental concepts about the nature of imperial rule and the relationship between political authority and divine sanction. Islamic historians frequently portrayed Sasanian kings as exemplars of just rule or cautionary examples of royal excess, utilizing Persian historical experience to illustrate moral and political principles relevant to their own times. The figure of Khosrow I in particular became a standard reference point for discussions of ideal kingship, while the collapse of the Sasanian Empire served as a reminder of the temporal nature of all earthly power. The Shahnameh epic tradition that reached its culmination in Ferdowsi's masterwork represented perhaps the most significant literary legacy of Sasanian civilization, preserving in poetic form the historical memories and cultural values that had sustained Persian identity throughout the imperial period. This monumental work, composed during the early Islamic period but drawing on sources that extended back to the Sasanian era, created a comprehensive narrative of Persian history that emphasized the heroic qualities and cultural achievements that had made Iran great. The epic's portrayal of legendary figures like Rostam and historical kings like Khosrow demonstrated the continuing vitality of Persian cultural traditions while adapting them to the literary conventions that characterized Islamic civilization. The influence of the Shahnameh on subsequent Persian literature and cultural development cannot be overstated, as it provided a foundational text that preserved Persian historical memory while offering models of heroic behavior and cultural identity that transcended political boundaries. The epic's emphasis on the struggle between Iran and Turan, representing the conflict between civilization and barbarism, reflected concepts that had been central to Sasanian imperial ideology, while providing frameworks for understanding subsequent historical developments. The international influence of Sasanian civilization extended well beyond the boundaries of the Islamic world, as Persian artistic, architectural, and administrative innovations were transmitted through trade networks and diplomatic contacts to regions as distant as China and Western Europe. The silk textiles that had been produced in Sasanian workshops influenced decorative traditions throughout Eurasia, while the architectural techniques developed for Persian palace construction were adapted for use in buildings from Spain to India. The administrative practices that had enabled effective Sasanian governance provided models for rulers throughout the medieval world who sought to create stable and efficient governmental systems. The scientific and philosophical traditions that had flourished under Sasanian patronage, including the translation movement that had brought Greek learning into Persian culture, continued to influence intellectual development throughout the Islamic world and beyond. The mathematical, astronomical, and medical knowledge that had been preserved and developed in Sasanian schools provided foundations for the scientific achievements that would characterize the Islamic Golden Age, while the philosophical synthesis that had emerged from the encounter between Persian and Greek intellectual traditions influenced theological and philosophical development throughout the medieval period. The ultimate legacy of the Sasanian Empire lay not in its political achievements, impressive though they were, but in its contribution to the cultural synthesis that would define medieval civilization throughout much of the known world. The administrative innovations, artistic traditions, and intellectual achievements that had characterized 4 centuries of Persian imperial rule provided essential elements for the Islamic civilization that succeeded it, while the cultural values and historical memories preserved through Zoroastrian and Persian literary traditions continue to influence human development long after the empire's political collapse. The transformation of the ancient world that followed the Arab conquests would have been inconceivable without the foundations that Sasanian civilization had established, just as the subsequent development of Islamic culture would have taken fundamentally different forms without the Persian contributions that shaped its essential characteristics. In this sense, the Sasanian Empire achieved a form of immortality that transcended political boundaries and religious divisions, leaving an indelible mark on human civilization that continues to influence cultural development to the present day.